Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Broccoli Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If White-Haired Deku Dilates time. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya, at some point along the line, has started to believe it when other people tell him that he must have a villain magnet quirk. He isn't sure what other option there is for this number of villain attacks centered around him. It started when it was Midoriya's turn for the grocery run. The dorm system has been in place for a few months at this point, and everything has settled nicely. The students make their own breakfast and lunches, and the class rotates on who cooks dinner for the rest of the dorm while it was supposed to be spread evenly. They find through trial and error that there are only a handful of people in one whose food is edible, and the schedule is remade accordingly. Bakugo ends up cooking the most often, and is the most likely to ignore the schedule entirely, frequently being heard yelling that he doesn't trust other people in his kitchen. The class as a whole is starting to develop an immunity to the absurd amount of spices Bakugo uses, especially the self-proclaimed Bakasquat who he cooks every meal for, and Midoriya himself. A veteran to the spice cabinet, the Bakugos used leniently. Grocery runs happen every other Sunday on a rotating schedule. They try to go in pairs, but after Minta's expulsion, there was a gap between his leaving and Shinsu's entrance into the hero course, leaving one person to go by themselves. Midoriya volunteered to do it alone, claiming it was only a short distance between the school and the store they use and that it wouldn't be a big deal this once, on the grounds of him having access to Shinsu for his future grocery shopping partner. As someone who was normally stuck with Todoroki, who was renowned for refusing to help buy anything that wasn't cold soba, Shinsu was a breath of fresh air despite his grumpy appearance. It was accepted easily as Kaminari had been the one scheduled originally, and Uraraka jokingly called out not to get in any fights while he was out. When he left, they should have known that they jinxed it. So on Sunday, September 3rd, 2:45, Midoriya left for the grocery store at 11 a.m., vowing to be back before 2 for their class bonding exercises, which was code for play Super Smash Bros. And scream at each other until Aizawa received a noise complaint from neighboring buildings and threatened to expel each and every one of them. Truthfully, it was Midoriya's favorite part of the week. He and Bakugo were currently 31-29, with him winning by a small margin. The walk to the store was uneventful as walks go. He waved to his favorite cashier when he got there before bringing out the list and starting the shopping. To be fair, he lasted about 15 minutes before the curse kicked in. He had been making a pretty decent time through the store, assisted by not having to wrangle Todoroki, when he heard a short scream from the front paired with an aggressive yell. He immediately dropped his basket and sped through the aisles, dropping into a crouch behind a display shelf of oranges to see what was happening. It was easy to deduct what the commotion was: an assumed robbery gone wrong, with a tall, lanky man holding a shaking gun to the cashier's forehead and a homely man with scraggly hair and a patchy beard holding a young girl by the scruff of her neck. The child was sobbing, and her mother was laying a while away, being held back by a man as she wailed to let her baby go. The man holding the child seemed to be on something, if the twitching and rapid glances said anything, or maybe he was just nervous. Regardless, his hands shook in a way that screamed something was about to happen, and Izuku had to make a split-second decision. The faint click of a gun made up his mind for him, and he shot out from behind the display case with a flash of green light, knocking the gun from the lanky man's hand in a swift motion before he raced to get the child. This is, presumably, where he made his first mistake. He knew that the hostage took precedence, that she could be used against him if he engaged in hand-to-hand, but not everything could go to plan in the life of Midoriya Izuku. He reached the little girl in another split second, cradling her to his chest. He skidded to a stop, shielding her face against his chest, and watched them carefully. The scraggly man had what looked like a beam of light charging in his hands, slowly growing brighter, and the lanky one was running towards Midoriya with his hand outstretched, presumably a 5-finger contact quirk he was intending to use. He felt something pang in his chest, a moment of terror as a child in a life-or-death situation, before turning and hugging his body around the girl. He whispered, near silently in her ear, "It's all right, you're okay. You did so well," and prayed that would be enough to comfort her in the moment. The second the last word left his mouth, he saw her eyes start to glow a faint golden color, her tears streaming liquid gold down her face. Just as the beam of light got blindingly bright and he felt the beginning of someone touching the back of his neck, they suddenly burst into a stream of gold, encasing her and Midoriya in their light with a sobbed scream, her body shaking in his grip. If you were to ask Class 1 what happened to Midoriya Izuku, they would look away and shrug. Some would get tears in their eyes, others would just hunch down and growl and "I don't fucking know." If you were to ask Aizawa what happened to his student, he would sigh and shake his head, murmuring something of problem child with a near mournful voice. If you were to ask Nezu what happened to one of his prized pupils, he would twitch, unnoticeable to the untrained eye, and the subject would switch before you could blink. If you were to ask Midoriya what happened to Midoriya Izuku, He would laugh and tell you the story of a group of friends who wanted to be heroes and of the boy who appeared out of thin air. When he woke up, the first thing he noticed was that everything hurt. It felt as if he had been run down by a truck, and then backed up over once more to make sure he was out. He opened his eyes slowly, expecting to see the all-too-familiar hospital wing that he found himself in once a week, with recovery girls scowling at him, the ferocity of a grandmother who deals with way too much shit plastered on her face. Instead, he saw a grocery store, completely empty and dark. He sat up slowly, looking around to get his bearings. Things were similar, but he would be lying if he said they were the same. It was the same building, just decorated differently and with different items. It was dark because the lights were off, and instead of midday like it had been when he passed out, it looked like the middle of the night, which would also explain why there wasn't anybody with him. Why would they just leave him in a grocery store though? This was clearly the same one. Why wouldn't anybody come and bring him back to UA for recovery? What happened to the little girl? And why did everything change? Not even in a renovation way, but more in a retro way. He went back in time. He sat up fully, pulling himself to his feet as he cursed himself out. You just had to go in without backup, didn't you, Izuku? You just couldn't bring Ada or Uraraka with you. You couldn't ask Aizawa-sensei to come with you to the store this once. You had to be the martyr and go by yourself. He would go to the grocery store with Todoroki for the rest of his life if it meant he could wake up and discover this was a bad dream. He hobbled slowly to the main doors, his hips popping uncomfortably and his back tight with pain. He opened the door reluctantly, expecting there to be some alarm, but was pleasantly surprised to find there wasn't one. As he looked around, he saw a few key details that further solidified his theory on time travel. The house down the block that held the tea shop wasn't built yet, and a few other buildings were either non-existent or dramatically different from what they had been a few hours ago. He looked around for a second, before taking in a deep breath and starting the short walk back to UA. Hopefully Nedzu would understand. What was that code that had to do with time travel? They learned it not too long ago. STC 502. He arrived at the gate, and before he could press a buzzer, a static noise came over the filter with an unfamiliar voice greeting him. Are you in need of assistance, young man? This is probably the current principal. That's not a good sign. STC 502. He mumbled, wincing at his raspy voice. Oh dear, the voice muttered. Come in. As he walked through the gate, an unfamiliar person was seen approaching him from the main building. They were awfully quick, and he wondered if it was a minor teleportation quirk, or maybe they're just fast. Before he could think much further on it, a soft hand gripped his upper arm gently, leading him to the building. You look a little worse for wear, don't you? Why are you here in the middle of the night? Izuku found himself asking, rather than the traditional greeting or even a hello, thank you for helping me. They just laughed lightly, continuing to guide them through the halls. He noticed they hadn't changed much, but he was far too tired and in far too much pain to let him know that much. I have an anti-sleep quirk. A principal's job is never over, you know. I find it easiest to get my paperwork done when there aren't other distractions. Izuku hummed in response. If he were in any other situation, he would find that absolutely fascinating. As it was, however, he could only find it in him to give a quiet hum of acknowledgement as they reached the hospital wing. They made their way in, and Izuku all but collapsed on the nearest cot. I summoned Recovery Girl. She'll be here soon. She lives on campus for things such as these events. The principal stated simply. In the meantime, would you mind telling me what year you're from and how you got here? Izuku groaned at the thought of having to talk with his voice feeling as roughed up as it was, but nodded. What he really wanted to do was sleep for a year and a half, but this was important. I'm from September 3rd, 2/45. He whispered. His throat hurt like a bitch, and he really wished he had some water. Oh, there's a glass of water. This man is a godsend. The principal laughed at that, and Midoriya blushed when he realized he had muttered it, choosing to look around the room rather than make eye contact. It was mostly the same as his time. The only differences being minor and arbitrary, things he only knew from the absurd amount of time he spent in the hospital wing with a broken something or other. Well, that is interesting, isn't it? It is currently September 4th, 2/30. It seems you've traveled back 15 years, young man. Izuku felt any ounce of tiredness in his body drain out immediately as he shot up into a sitting position. 15 years. The longest known time jump is only a year and a half. How did I get so far back? He yelled, his voice crackling. It made sense, in a way, since Nedzu wasn't the current principal. He would be lying if he said he hadn't expected it to be farther back than what was considered normal because of the circumstances. But to hear it in words, that is a good question, indeed. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? Tell me what happened. And so Izuku explained everything. The dorm system because of the villain attacks, how he volunteered to go by himself for the grocery run because of the odd number of students, the two villains and the little girl, how all three quirks seemed to touch him at the same time. And how he woke up in the same building and knew he had time traveled because of the different interior and the different buildings around. His head was fuzzy around the edges with exhaustion and his eyes struggled to stay open, but he was at least sure he got the major details correct. Well, that is curious, isn't it? If their quirks are unknown, and you were hit by all three at once, I doubt we are going to have any information on how long this will last. I do have an unfortunate hunch that this isn't going to be a day trip, though I must warn you. Because of circumstances, it won't be like one singular quirk where you'll come back once it wears off. This seems like a one-way trip, he said regretfully. Was your quirk activated? He asked, almost gently. Midoriya felt his heart stop in his chest. A one-way trip. That means he won't be able to see Uraraka again. He can't see Todoroki again. He can't beat Bakugo in Smash Bros. Later today. He can't welcome Shinsu into their class and break down their walls to befriend them. He can't. He won't ever see them again. Or at least not for another 15 years. How is he supposed to? Young man, a voice broke through his spiral. He noticed there were tears rolling down his cheeks. He coughed, before saying, Midoriya Izuku. That's my name, Midoriya Izuku. And it was active. But I don't think it would have affected the situation. It's a power-up quirk that stockpiles energy, basically. It typically presents as strength enhancements, but there's a chance it could start manifesting in different ways if I train it. The principal hummed in response, looking deep in thought. Well, it might have given the other quirks the energy to complete the time jump if it's a stockpile quirk. Those stockpiles aren't normally that strong. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. I was a really late bloomer. It didn't come in until I was 14. Apparently it was so strong it could have blown my limbs off before I developed muscle mass. By that time, it had stockpiled a lot of energy. The principal nodded, looking a little skeptical, but not questioning it further. They lapsed into a silence, and Izuku took that time to look the man over to see if he recognized him from any hero research. He was tall and thin, with deep black hair braided back from his face, ending somewhere on his upper back. He had dark black eyes, and white rings around his pupil that looked like tree trunk lines. He had deep eye bags under his eyes, presumably because of his quirk, and was clean-shaven with light freckles on his nose and a mole under his right eye. He was wearing a long black robe, neat white strips of fabric tying around his chest in an intricate design, and had a white cloak draped over his shoulders. Breaking up his overall sophisticated look, however, were the pink bunny slippers adorned on his feet, worn from use with little smiles and fluffy cotton tails. He overall looked completely unfamiliar, and Izuku found himself wondering just who this man was and how he was so unknown. If he had an anti-sleep quirk, it would make sense for him to be an underground hero, but even then Izuku had never seen him on any of his forums. He browsed. Maybe. This better be good. Tsukushima-mon. If I was woken up and dragged to work at 12:30 in the morning for no reason, then I will personally make sure you get a good night's rest, despite that quirk of yours. She cut herself off as she saw Midoriya sitting there, looking sheepish. Where did you find a child? She hissed at the principal, apparently Tsukushima. He just sighed, before explaining everything that has happened so far. An idea occurred to Izuku suddenly as he finished explaining. And Izuku blurted out, recovery girl, if I said I was the 9th, would that mean anything to you? Are you? Is doctor yet? Recovery girl's eyes suddenly widened as she stared at Midoriya with an incredulous expression. It does, I am. You're the 9th. Well, that does make things a fair bit more complicated, doesn't it? Izuku nodded sheepishly. Recovery girl hummed, putting her hand to her face as she thought. I wonder how that will affect your timeline. How are we supposed to explain this to that big doofus? She cut herself off as she realized the look the principal was giving her. Izuku doubted the man had ever been more out of the loop in his life. I'll explain it to you later, Tsukushima. For now, let me look you over, young man. Don't worry about any of that stuff right now. There's nothing that can be done about it now. We'll come up with a plan. Recovery girl soothed as she started looking him over. He felt any tension and fear that had been in his mind seep out slowly with her reassurances. She was right. There was nothing he could do. It would be arbitrary to worry about something that far out of his control. Recovery girl kissed his forehead after checking him over quickly, and he was aware no longer. It will be better when he wakes up. It has to be. When Izuku woke up, the sun was up again. A glance at the clock across the room told him it was 11, later than what he slept for a long time. It took him a long second to remember what happened, and when he remembered he groaned loudly, knocking his head back onto the pillows. As he stewed everything over, Recovery Girl entered the room. When she saw he was awake, she immediately made a beeline towards him, tapping the ground with her cane in a rapid pace. For someone so small, she did move rather quickly. Oh, you're awake. The principal has been caught up on the situation regarding your quirk, so you don't have to worry about him. Your homeroom teacher is in the loop as well. She started out, immediately clearing up any worries he had. Izuku sighed quietly from relief at not having to explain the concept of an inherited quirk to either adult. It was difficult enough in his timeline. Add time travel to that and it made everything far more complex than it needed to be. Recovery Girl continued on. bustling around him and checking him over for any lasting effects as she talked. I recovered your wallet and I saw your student ID. Since you were in the hero course, after some further discussions we have decided that if you choose you can continue on in the hero course. We saw you have your provisional license, so instead of the first years like you were, you'll be put with the second years, since the first years don't have their licenses here and all. You'll keep up with them much better if that's how far along you are. The homeroom teacher will test you academically to see where you stand and give you supplemental classes as needed for everything else. Izuku felt the misery and self-pity party he was having turn into incredulity. See, second years. Are you sure? I mean, I'm only halfway through my first year. He cried out. Don't you listen at all? Recovery girl grunted. I said, you'll be tested and placed in supplemental classes where needed. You have your provisional license. You'll only be held back in the first year classes. Plus the principal decided that the second years have more open spaces, to say the least. You'll catch up in no time at all. You still want to be a hero, don't you? She added sternly, pausing from where she had been prodding him and testing his reflexes. Of course I do, he stuttered indignantly. She nodded, a pleased look on her face, and finished his exam and before nodding him off. You can go get changed and shower in the bathroom. There's clothes there for you. We had to get rid of anything you brought with you in case you brought back a disease none of us have immunity for. Though we managed to sanitize your wallet and there is a new pair of shoes in there for you. You'll be able to buy a phone later. Yours wouldn't have worked anyways this far back anyways. Afterwards, head to the principal's office. You have a lot to go over with him. Midoriya nodded numbly and got up to head to the bathroom she pointed out. Sitting on the counter was a school uniform, fresh boxers and socks, his plain leather wallet as promised, and a shiny new pair of shoes. He showered quickly, brushing his teeth with a spare toothbrush, and even managed to find some deodorant and hair products to make himself look less homeless and tired. After putting on the new uniform and shoes, he finally headed out to the principal's office. It was a Monday, so he knew class was still in, but there were only a few stragglers in the hallway. A teacher passed him, someone he's never seen before, and gave him a strange look, but luckily didn't say anything about it. When he reached the principal's office, for a split second he thought the doors would open automatically like they did when you visit Nedzu before he remembered it wasn't Nedzu. It was Tsukishima. He knocked, ignoring the strange sense of disappointment at the new reminder, and a voice called out for him to come in. Tsukishima's office was nothing like Nedzu's, where his was a basic principal's office, classic Japanese-styled. Tsukishima's was more of a personal living room. The brown leather couch was replaced by a white, plush love seat with two other matching chairs scattered across the office as well as a yellow beanbag chair. There was an eclectic collection of multicolored pillows on almost every surface, and several different patterned rugs overlapping each other to cover what Izuku knew to be plain brown hardwood. The big desk was the same, but instead of being neatly organized with an overly large chair, it was an absolute mess of papers, pens with tassels on the ends, and bobbleheads, the plain chair being replaced by a large, yellow chair that oddly resembled an egg yolk. There was a hammock in the back corner, and most prominently, there were plants absolutely everywhere. Books were still littered across the bookshelves, but instead of being worrying titles that had to do with world domination and taking down society, there was old and new literature, titles in both Japanese, English, and surprisingly, German. Overall, Izuku found it was much less of an intimidating space than what he had expected. Tsukishima looked up from his pages of work sitting in front of him, curled up in his egg chair. Midoriya, welcome. I'm sure you're off put by the office, as most are when they first arrive. I find it easier to stay here the majority of the time rather than just bringing my work to a different location I won't use anyways. So I made the office much more homey. I find it peaceful, don't you think? Midoriya nodded silently. This man was nothing like he has ever met before, and he can't tell how to feel about it. Well, let's get straight into the swing of things then, shall we? Basically, because you have your provisional license, we've decided to place you with Class 2A. There are 11 other students, so you'll make the 12th. You'll be taking an all-encompassing test tomorrow to see where you're at and if you'll need any extra classes to catch up. But no worries if you do. Midoriya nodded along again, so he continued on his spiel. We can't inform the commission that you're a time traveler. I'm sure you know why. They can't have that kind of power. It would be awful for you and everybody else. So we need to come up with a backstory for you. The teachers that you'll be working with directly will be informed. And you have complete control if you choose to tell anybody else if you make friends, but for the most part you can't just say you're from 2x45. Any ideas? Midoriya shook his head quietly. It was easier to let Tsukishima do all the talking. He seemed to have a plan. He was much like Nedzu in the sense that his questions were less so questions and more so acknowledgments of the other's existence. Great. We'll be going with the basic cover that you're in witness protection because of an accident that killed your parents. You're now a ward of UA, so you'll be living on campus in the teachers' dorms, and you can tell people that. If anybody presses for information, just say it's confidential because of the circumstances surrounding their death. He sounded very cheerful despite the worrisome words leaving his mouth, and it gave Izuku a bit of whiplash listening to him speak. He was strangely cheerful about all this. Izuku nodded again, regardless of the multitude of big feelings. You'll also need a new name. I know that might be difficult, but we have no idea how you being here will affect things. And if I'm correct, you should be being born within the next year if you haven't been already. It would be a bit obvious if there were two Midoriya Izukus running around. Midoriya paused to think. He's always wondered what he would want to be named if it wasn't Midoriya. Maybe Yagi Izuku. A blush spread across his cheeks just saying it, but it felt right. If he could never see his mentor again, at least not in the same light as before, the least he could do is honor him with his last name. And Izuku. That's all he had left of his mother. He couldn't abandon it that easily. Gotcha. So you have a backstory and a new name. Next is the hard part. Your new hero name. It would be foolish to keep the same name you had. If you really want to keep it, you can. But if some kid out there hears of a hero named Deku and recognizes it, that's on you, he said sternly, pointing at Izuku with the pen he had been using to jot down the information they decided on. It was less intimidating than it should have been because of the pink pom-pom on the end. He paused, thinking everything over. He had never really had the option to think of a hero name. Everything he came up with as a child was some play-off of All Might, and once Uraraka reclaimed Deku for him, it was pretty much cemented that that would be his hero name. Well, there is always tomorrow's hero, Condone. Tsukishima paused, pen hovering above the paper. Condone. Pretty on the nose, isn't it? Izuku smiled, though it was more so a grimace than anything. I don't fit, I might as well embrace it. Tsukishima nodded, his lips twitching down slightly at his explanation, almost in pity. Well, now it's on to the less fun parts. We have a lot of paperwork to draft up. I have some connections to get everything done, but we need to craft you a whole new identity. 2.5 hours later, Izuku's hand was cramped from holding a pen for so long, and there were so many applications and different paperwork spread around them that Izuku couldn't tell what was what. Tsukishima nodded finally, putting his pen down and stating, and that's it. The paperwork is over. I'll get this expedited. You'll be legally Yagi Izuku, born July 15th, 2/15 by the end of the week. I'll get you a birth certificate with fake names on it for the parents, an ID, a student card, and your new provisional license as soon as I have them. We'll have your quirk registered as stockpile. If someone asks what it means, just tell them that you're stockpiling your own energy rather than predecessors through One for All. Sound good? Izuku nodded, yawning slightly. He glanced down at his watch, before adding on, your new homeroom teacher will be in soon. You can go ahead and rest on whatever you want until then. I know things have been draining this past day, and wasn't that the understatement of the century? Izuku woke up yesterday morning with life as normal, and now he's 15 years in the past with a different name, no friends, and no family. The grief hasn't struck him yet, but he knows it will soon. For now, he'll nap and wait to meet his new teacher. He wondered faintly if they would be anything like Aizawa-sensei, but didn't have time to think further before he collapsed in the hammock, out like a light before his head fully hit the net. He woke up from his nap to voices. When he had fallen asleep, it was just him and the principal, so this must be his new homeroom teacher. He opened his eyes to look around, only to see Netsu. He stared for a minute, his mind still waking up, before he suddenly groaned miserably as the realization that Nedzu was going to be his homeroom teacher. They both turned and looked at him at the noise, and as Izuku turned into a strawberry, Netsu laughed cheerfully. I take it that you know me? He asked, a joyful glint in his eyes. Why, yeah, I do. You were the principal of UA in my time. He stuttered out, recovering from the embarrassment of slipping up like that. Netsu's eyes turned on a manic gleam, one Izuku knew all too well, and he and Tsukishima cringed at the same time at the memory, thought of him with that much power. Tsukishima shuddered a bit, before quickly changing the topic. Well, I have a visitor that should be arriving any minute now that will be able to help you out with some further details. She works with witness protection. Her quirk allows her to alter someone's physical appearance as long as she can picture it in her head. A knock at the door interrupted him, and he smiled slightly. Speak of the devil, and she shall arrive. Come in. A woman, incredibly tall with dark brown hair tied back in a tight bun at the top of her neck, entered. She was wearing a basic black pencil skirt and white blouse with a black blazer over top, and she looked stern, though there was a soft edge to her face when she made eye contact with Izuku. This is the boy. Time skip, am I right? Tsukishima nodded, leaning back in his egg chair. That's him. You two can talk it over, change him up a little, and then we can discuss everything else when Netsu and him leave for the dorms. Izuku was curious as to what they would be discussing, but he figured it wasn't his business if he wasn't involved in the conversation. He's sure he'll be informed if it's important. The woman turned towards him and had a slight smile on her face as she sat in the chair in front of Izuku. So, is there anything specific you would want? Generally, things I can change are height, hair color, eye color, and any marks that would give you away, such as any special moles or scars. Izuku hesitated, thinking it over. He's never thought about what he wanted to look like. He was just him, though being taller did sound nice. Well, my biological dad had white hair, so maybe that. And maybe longer too, like shoulder length. And a few inches taller would be nice, for sure. Of course, and for your eye color. Do you want any of these scars gone? Izuku paused. His scars reminded him of where he came from. Reminds him of his fight with Todoroki, of his battle against Muscular, of saving Koda and Eri. He couldn't imagine being who he is without them, so he shook his head. No, I'd like to keep the scars. Plus, to be honest with you, I would probably end up getting similar ones anyways. My quirk is a little strong, and any colored eyes will work. I'm not picky. Maybe gray. She nodded. Gray it is. Take a few deep breaths for me, give me your hand, and I'll get started. It'll feel a little weird, and you'll get some sharp growing pains from the height being added, but it won't be excruciating. Izuku nodded and started familiar breathing exercises, stretching his hand forward for the woman to take. Sure enough, a few seconds after she made contact with him, his lower back, hips, and knees started aching with sharp, radiating pain, though it wasn't severe at all. His head felt tingly, and his eyes burned a little, like he had cried for too long or had a bout of dry eye. It wasn't painful, just a bit unpleasant, but after a few long moments it was over. When he opened his eyes, she was smiling at him, a little broader than before, and was looking all over his face, head, and legs, which he noticed were now resting comfortably against the floor rather than dangling slightly above it. She nodded finally, deeming him appropriately changed, and stood up, holding her hand out for him to grab. He wondered why until he accepted it. As he stood, his entire body started swaying to the left. Tsukishima snorted quietly from behind his desk, and the lady cracked a small smile. Vertigo. It'll get better in a few hours. Just don't go hopping between buildings until then. He's all yours, Netsu. Tsukishima nodded at Izuku. I guess it's time to show you where you'll be staying. You'll take the comprehension test tomorrow morning, and join the hero course in the afternoon. There are 2 other wards of UA, so he'll introduce you, show you where you'll stay, and then leave you to your devices. There's a credit card funded by UA on your dining room table, as the apartment is very bare, so you'll be able to buy whatever decorations, furniture, and clothes you need or want online. Don't worry about costs. The commission funds it because of the law to do with wards, and I love spending their money. In fact, spend as much as you can. Tsukishima added, a glint in his eye that Midoriya recognized from his time in Aizawa's class. He immediately decided Netsu was less threatening with the way this conversation was heading and scampered after him to head to the dorm building. The walk was quiet, but not awkward. Midoriya was busy in his head, and Netsu quietly reflected on this strange boy and what class would be like with him involved. He was rather excited at the new unknown variable. As they reached the dorm, they heard faint crashing from inside, and Netsu sighed almost inaudibly. You're about to meet your fellow wards. One of them is a little much, but the other is very reserved. You would think they balanced each other out. Netsu just sighed again, exhausted already, before opening the door up to reveal a very disheveled room. Presumably, the first ward he would stay with was a tall girl with long dark green hair, leaves sprouting out of her roots among the curls, and pale green skin. She was wearing a dark brown jumpsuit tied around her waist, and an even darker brown tank top. She was standing on a table while screaming, hopping back and forth like some sort of tap dance. On the floor, the reason for her panic jumping, there was a figure with dark black hair swatting at an overly large cockroach with a broom. He looks familiar. Aizawa, he muttered, only Netsu hearing him. Netsu gave him a knowing look, but before they could step into the room the girl noticed them. NEDZUSENSEI. New boy. Get it. Aizawa was still slamming the broom on the ground with surprising force, his face a little pale as it skittered around him. It touched his shoe and fluttered its wings threateningly, and he immediately gave up, joining the girl on the table and looking expectantly at the 2 in the doorway. Netsu laughed before coming up and catching the bug easily with a cup. He picked it up and brought it outside, and Izuku watched as the girl practically melted in relief. My savior, she sighed. Aizawa huffed in distaste, before crawling off the table and fully noticing Izuku. Who's new kid? He grunted. Why Yagi Izuku? Izuku mumbled, looking anywhere but Aizawa's eyes. This is weird. His sensei was standing in front of him, 15 years younger, featuring shorter hair and no scar in sight. His eye bags were somehow darker, and he lacked the healthy layer of fat that their teacher had instead. He was all skin and bones, with knobby elbows and knees poking out through his clothes. Aizawa shouted, he said in response, before turning around and going back to what he had presumably been doing before the bug got in. Oh, new kid. You have really cool hair. My name is Ito Nanoka, but everyone calls me Nana. You're Yagi. She had a faint accent, her vowels tilting up and her voice soft as butter. She seemed kind. Izuku could only nod along weakly. This is overwhelming. He missed his classmates. He missed his friends, his mom. He missed Yagi. He missed the Aizawa that knew him. Well, I hope you can enjoy staying here. It will be weird at first, but it gets better, Nana said gently. She must have picked up on his distress. He was sure he wasn't being very subtle. He just nodded once more. And Nezu said something he didn't quite pick up before leading him to his room. Aizawa's was right across the hall, and Nana's was on the other side of the floor. He had his own living room, bedroom, kitchenette, and half bathroom. There was a shared bathroom in the middle of the floor with communal tubs and a lock on the inside so nobody could barge in, the common room downstairs, and the big kitchen branching off of it. The upper floors were where Nezu and Recovery Girl stayed, the rest of the teachers choosing to live off campus. Izuku took all of this in, and even managed to say goodbye to Nezu as he left, but the second he left he found himself collapsing on the floor of the empty living room. Everything he knows is gone. All of his friends are gone, and probably don't know what happened to him. He'll never see Bakugo, or Uraraka, or Tsu, or any of them again. Not like he used to. The next time he'll be able to see them he'll be as old as Aizawa-sensei, gone for over 15 years. Will he remember their faces, their voices, their quirks? He'll never be their friend again, and his mother, his sweet mother. He can never see her again. Not if he wants to keep this under wraps. Yagi will never hold him while he cries. Mike will never put smiley faces on the corner of his tests. Midnight will never ruffle his hair. In passing he glanced up and caught sight of himself in the reflection of the window. He looked good. He'll give the woman credit for that. But he looked nothing like Midoriya Izuku. Nothing like his old life. The grief of the last day caught up with him, and he felt the dam break. A violent sob tore out of his throat, and he curled in on himself, shaking like a leaf as he cried. His throat ached from the wails, and he faintly hoped that the walls were soundproof, but even with the thought of someone discovering him he couldn't bring himself to stop crying. He rocked himself back and forth, desperately trying to calm the meltdown that was fast approaching, but couldn't do anything to stop the screaming cries as he grieved his entire life. He desperately knocked his hands against the side of his head, trying to pound the misery out of his head, but just let out another muffled wail whenever the sharp pain mingled with the grief in a terrible combination. He wasn't aware of the quiet knock on his door, or when it cracked open. He didn't see when Aizawa knelt across from him, coaching his breathing and gently redirecting when he tugged his hair and hit his chest. He only began to notice there was another person when the worst of it started to quiet, his violent sobs and screaming turning into miserable whimpers and silent tears. He looked up slowly, and was more than a bit surprised to see his old homeroom teacher kneeling in front of him, calmly instructing his breathing, his hands folded in his lap to prevent from reaching out to him by accident. He was the right distance away. Not touching, but close enough Izuku could tell he was there. He let out a short whine and ducked his head back down into his knees. How embarrassing. Aizawa's first impression of him is nothing less than a full meltdown. That truly speaks wonders on how things have been going for him. Hey, none of that, Aizawa said, voice bordering soft in a tone Izuku hadn't heard from the man before he paused, continuing on a more hesitant note. Listen, I don't know why you're a ward of UA, or why you're starting halfway through second year, but know that we understand. Me and Nana. I was in foster homes my entire childhood. I didn't get a break until I was accepted into UA, and Nezu noticed the signs of abuse. It's safe here. It might be weird and unconventional, but it's safe and warm, and you'll be all right. His words were awkward and stilted, but you could see the effort he was putting into it to make sure he was saying the right thing. Izuku felt a warm spot replace a large part of the terrifying Continuum that had been there the past few hours. Izuku sniffed again, before looking back up to Aizawa. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice got caught in his throat. He furrowed his eyebrows in frustration at his lack of functioning vocal cords. But Aizawa noticed and added, "Do you sign? Would that be easier?" Izuku nodded, relieved. "Sorry, didn't mean to. It's all just so much." Aizawa nodded in sympathy. "It's all right. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I'm not the best with emotions, but there are some other kids in our class who will be able to help more. Tomorrow, you can sit with us at lunch if you want. They're kind of loud, but they're harmless. Just like Nana, she's loud and mouthy, but she's harmless and could never hurt a fly," Aizawa said, a gentle look on his face as he thought about his apparent friends. Izuku hesitated before nodding, signing a simple thank you. Aizawa blushed and looked away before nodding and mumbling, "I'm glad you're a little better. I was going to just let you cry it out. I know sometimes that's necessary, but then it started getting scary and I was worried. Let me know if you need anything." "All right, Yagi." Izuku nodded again, and gave Aizawa a small smile as he got up to leave. His lips twitched a little, but he just blushed again and left quickly, shutting the door behind him. Who knew Aizawa used to be cute? Izuku hummed to himself as he rocked a bit to further soothe his shot nerves. It was nice to have someone help him. Much better than going through those alone. None of his old friends had ever seen him freak out like that. and his mom didn't understand or know how to help, so he tended to just lock himself up in his room whenever he was overwhelmed. It was different, but nice nonetheless. Aizawa was rough around the edges, but he was kind. It was something he already knew from the peeks into his personal life that showed through his teaching persona, but seeing it up close was different. As Izuku went to bed that night, exhausted and over everything, he didn't feel as miserable as he did before. He'll see them all again one day. He just needs to survive until then. Maybe this won't be half bad. The next morning, he woke up earlier than what he wanted. The extra sleep from the day before plus falling asleep so early last night unfortunately meant waking up at 4 instead of his healthy 6. He laid still for a moment, wallowing over the unfortunate string of events he's gone through, before deciding it was as good a time as any to do some online shopping for his new dorm apartment. Just as the principal had mentioned, there was a standard laptop with an innocent-looking credit card sitting next to it on the table in the kitchen. Glancing around the apartment, he noticed that Tsukishima was right when he said it was bare bones. The living room was an open concept with a panel of windows sitting on the wall facing the door, a perfect view of the forest being overlooked. The floors were dark oak and seemed slightly worn from time, and the walls were a clean, pristine white. To the left, there was an open kitchenette with a sink, fridge, oven, and microwave, all stainless steel and relatively new-looking. A small, two-person table was set neatly against the front wall in the kitchen, where the laptop and credit card was. To the right of the living room, there was a wall with 2 doors. The closest to the door was the half-bath, looking almost identical to the one he had in the student dorms. The final door on the left was his bedroom. It had the same dark oak floors as the rest of the house, with the same white walls as well. It featured a standard full-sized bed with provided UA sheets. Not exactly the softest material, but tolerable. It didn't have any other furniture in the room besides that, but it had a large glass door with a balcony leading outside on the back wall. The balcony was the same as it had been in the student dorms, and Izuku felt a flash of nostalgia at the sudden prominent memory of Aoyama leaving him a cheese platter. Izuku sighed as he stretched out before sitting down at the table and getting to work. He's never had to decorate a house before. His mom always did all of that, but he's sure he can figure out the necessities and take it from there. His first goal was to go to a website that sold phones. He told himself if he wanted to make any friends, he would need to be able to keep in contact with them. Picking out one of the newer models of his favorite brand, he picked same-day delivery and submitted it immediately. He wasn't shy to admit he was a product of his generation. Moving to some of the more basic items, he found all of his usual hygiene products plus a few to account for his new hairstyle, and picked out basic kitchen utensils, pots and pans, and dishware to get it over with. It was easy to find things he knew he used on a daily basis, and it took him almost no time at all to pick out all of the basic apartment accessories he would need and some electronics that caught his eye. Moving on to the larger pieces of furniture, he found a large, green couch and a few neutral-colored beanbags to scatter around the living room, as well as a multitude of pillows to pile on the couch, chairs, bed, and floor. There was a basic hanging cocoon chair advertised for pressure therapy, and he debated for no less than a minute before determining that it wouldn't hurt to try it out and added it to his cart. For his bedroom, he picked out some basic cotton sheets he knew had a good texture paired with a soft-looking comforter, as well as a matching set of furniture with a headboard, desk, dresser, and nightstand, all a dark stain that would match the floors relatively well. He added a desk chair, a large dark-colored rug, and some fun accessories for his room and was ready to check out until he saw the hero merchandise section. It wasn't a large selection, but he added a few All Might posters and a figurine that looked like the one he had as a kid, as well as a keychain for his bag. It hurt looking at the face of the man who didn't know him anymore, but he felt almost empty without it all. Picking out school supplies was Izuku's personal favorite pastime, and with an assortment of different colored notebooks, highlighters, pens, pencils, and folders in his cart, it wasn't hard to see why. He struggled to find a backpack for a while. He had never had to pick out a new one with him having the same highlighter yellow one since elementary and all. But he found a lighter shade of a yellow bag. Just reminiscent enough of his old bag, he decided it was perfect. Finally, last but not least, he deep-dived across several clothing websites to pick out a new wardrobe. He debated sticking with his usual fashion of odd shirts and plain looks, but ultimately decided that while Deku might dress like that, Quantum wouldn't, maybe just an upgraded version. He sat for a moment, thinking over how he was supposed to put together an outfit that wasn't a t-shirt and jeans, when he realized it all at once. Clearing his throat, he pushed his face into his best Bakugo scowl and stared at his computer as if it had just insulted his very being. The Bakugus were the most fashion-forward people he knew. Auntie Mistuki would never let him walk around looking like a fashion disaster. So if he just pretended that she was dressing him up like she used to when he was younger, it will all fall into place. Ingenious. He ended up mostly scrolling through the female sections rather than the male sections, much to his own hesitation. But every time he thought about switching to the males section, his inner Bakugu smacked the back of his head and called him a coward. It was a very effective method of shopping. For his shirts, he varied between a wide variety of neutral options, his favorites being turtlenecks, button-ups, t-shirts, and a few comfortable-looking hoodies. Most of the tees were graphic, much to his inner auntie's chagrin, but the overall way he was determined to style them felt different enough that he wasn't particularly upset with himself. His favorite hoodie he picked out by far was the forest green and cream-colored hoodie with large, floppy bunny ears coming from the hood. For pants, he picked out a pair of light blue straight-legged jeans, a dark gray baggier pair of jeans, a pair of gray sweats, and 2 long skirts that would swish around his ankles comfortably, one black and one green. He had decided they had looked too comfy to pass up on. He picked out a multitude of workout clothes, sleepwear, boxers, and socks, as well as a formal outfit that featured a white shirt and a dark gray tux to go with it, and finally he moved on to shoes. He picked a plain pair of black dress shoes, a pair of Doc Martens that looked kind of cool, and a pair of classic Converse he had always wanted but never had the money to get, and the shopping was finally over. By the time his spree was done, it was about time for him to leave. He chose the same-day shipping for all of his orders, before submitting them and moving to get ready for school. His shower was nice. The hot water did wonders for washing off the tension he had been carrying. And he donned the same clothes he wore the day before packing his laptop in the laptop bag provided and heading out to the school. He couldn't help but mourn a bit at the idea he was doing his first day of second year without anybody by his side, but shook it off enough to leave the dorms without breaking down again. He knows he's never been in this part of the building before. Despite being in UA for more than half a year, he had yet to stray too far beyond his usual classroom and the lunchroom, or the weight room and training fields. Class 2 was in an entirely different part of the building, and he knew he would get lost, leading to him leaving his room an entire 30 minutes early so he could try and get there on time. He can do it. Okay, he overestimated his ability to navigate the absolute hell that was UA. He definitely can't do it. It had been about 25 minutes of his mindless wandering, and he was completely and utterly lost. He was finally reaching the intense part of the 5 stages of grief he experienced over his inevitable demise from Nezu absolutely murdering him for being late on his first day when suddenly an overly loud voice drew his attention. He felt his entire body freeze as he slowly turned around. And sure enough, there he was, present Mike in the flesh, his hair much shorter than what it would grow to be but still styled in the classic updo he sported and a slightly rounded face with no facial hair, giving him a baby look. He walked with a student that had light blue, wispy hair and a white strip of bandage on their nose, and Aizawa, who looked even more tired than usual. He froze, watching them for a split second, and in that second Aizawa caught his eye, nudging the other two to shut up. "Hey, are you new?" the blue-haired kid asked. Aizawa cut him off before Izuku could stutter out an answer, saying simply, "He's a new ward, we met yesterday." "Yagi, right." Izuku paused, confused for a minute, before starting and nodding quickly. "Why yeah, Yagi Izuku. I got lost looking for Class 2A, he muttered, pointedly not making eye contact so he wouldn't freak out more than what he already was. Baby present Mike suddenly got excited, bouncing up and down a little before all but yelling, "Hey, that's our Class 2. Follow us, Yagi, we'll lead you there." Izuku smiled a little before nodding, and tailed behind their group like a lost duckling as the blue-haired kid continued what he had been saying. Aizawa lagged behind the others, choosing to stand beside Izuku. "That's Yamada. He's a little bit of a dumbass, but he's harmless. He gets stupidly loud sometimes because of his quirk, so don't be surprised. The other one is Shirakumo. He's also loud and dumb but not nearly as much as Yamada." Aizawa got a tired expression on his face that Izuku knew very well. "Welcome to the group of extroverts. Try and hold on as well as you can." Izuku let out a noise that faintly resembled a laugh, just choked off and quiet. Aizawa glanced over, and his face softened a bit from the dead stare he sported at what was surely an "I'm overwhelmed" expression in Izuku's eyes. He opened his mouth, probably to say something reassuring like he did yesterday. But before he could, Yamada suddenly announced, "And here we are." Aizawa just sighed again, and Izuku stuttered out his thanks as Yamada laughed and brushed it off. The moment they walked into the room, however, Nezu looked up from where he had been sitting behind his desk, a crazed grin on his face at the sight of Izuku. Yagi, brilliant timing. I just finished uploading the test you'll be taking. We'll get that set up for you and you can begin." Nezu let out a manic, joy-filled cackle and everybody in the room paled a few shades in response. "Dude," Yamada whispered. "What did you do to Nezu already? His tests are awful. Izuku laughed quietly, his voice only a bit strained, before explaining in a hushed voice. I'm skipping a grade. I'm technically still a first year, I guess. Where I come from, we already had our provisional licenses, so the principal decided to put me with Tua so I wouldn't be held back. Because of that, I have to take an academic placement test to see what classes I'll have to take extra work for. Yamada and Shirakumo looked faint at the idea. Only a first year. You're a baby, Shirakumo mumbled, his face pale. Izuku blushed scarlet, before quickly scurrying away to Netsu's desk to get the test set up on his laptop to avoid responding to that comment, because class would still be happening in the same room. Izuku was allowed to wear headphones connected to his laptop that would play a simple study track. He was informed he would have until lunch to complete as much of it as he could, but not to stress if he couldn't finish it all or skipped a few questions. As the first bell rang, Izuku took off. The majority of it was pretty easy, like science, quirk theory, and English. He struggled more with literature, since he hadn't had the time to complete all of the books that the rest of them did. And math was about as he remembered. The test ranged from early middle school up to stuff he had never heard of, but he did his best to answer everything, or at least attempt to answer, and before he knew it the lunch bell was ringing and Yamada was tapping his shoulder. Dude, watching you take that test was insane, Yamada said while Izuku submitted it and packed the laptop into his bag. Your fingers were moving so fast. And every once in a while you would start muttering real quiet and fast. Nobody could make out a single word of what you were saying. Izuku laughed sheepishly and rubbed the back of his neck. Sorry, I know that was probably distracting. Everybody always yells at me to knock it off when I do that. Sometimes my brain just moves so fast I end up saying it aloud. You know. Yamada and Shirakumo got a bewildered expression on their faces, and Aizawa just stared flatly at Izuku that somehow conveyed "Are you serious?" perfectly, something he recognized from his homeroom's endeavors. No, dude, it's fine, Shirakumo said, his voice light but his expression a little pinched. We could barely hear you, you didn't distract anybody. And even if we could hear you more, we get it. Sometimes you have to think out loud. Nobody here will judge you for that. Izuku felt his face redden even further and he opened and closed his mouth a few times, struggling to find words to say, before settling on nodding with a small smile. Aizawa's lips twitched again and he looked away quickly. And Yamada and Shirakumo both smiled so brightly it was almost blinding. Let's just go to lunch, Aizawa muttered, his face pink. Shirakumo glanced at him, before looking between Izuku and Aizawa rapidly, a stupid grin suddenly on his face. Yeah, let's go to lunch. You coming, Yagi? Shirakumo said, the face not slipping once. Izuku, while confused at the sudden reaction, nodded shyly and followed them out towards the cafeteria, which thankfully hadn't changed. They inched through the line, no less busy than it had been in his time, but just as Izuku expected them to turn right back into the cafeteria, they turned left. Izuku paused, a little confused, but followed them anyway as he decided they would tell him if they didn't want him there anymore. They trailed up a few flights of stairs, Shirakumo and Yamada talking about whatever they had learned during class while Aizawa and Izuku walked quietly behind them. Finally, they reached a big metal door at the top of the building, and Shirakumo silently passed his tray to Yamada at the sight. He didn't hesitate to take it and waited patiently for Shirakumo to finish, picking the lock. Unexpected, but not a deal breaker. After a second of fiddling, Shirakumo got the doors open, and they filed out onto the roof. It was a bright day, cold from the incoming winter chills, but not cloudy or rainy thankfully. Yamada took a deep breath at the slight bite, his eyes closed and a large grin on his face as he enjoyed the fresh air before they scurried away from the front of the roof into a little alcove, hidden from the wind and the edge of the building where anyone could see them. There was already a girl sitting there, and after a moment of looking at her, Izuku recognized her as pro-hero Midnight, after a second of cursing himself out for meeting every single person he knew in his time. He brushed it off as well as he could and ducked into the spot left for him next to Aizawa. As he settled, Midnight suddenly interrupted her loud complaints about how long it took them to stop and stare dead at Izuku. There's who's the new kid, she questioned, looking more than a bit confused at his arrival. Izuku felt his face turn scarlet under the scrutiny, any explanation dying in his throat as he ducked his face down into his chest to avoid looking at her. Yamada cheerfully explained he was new in their class as a noise thumped through the air, presumably Aizawa smacking the back of her head if her whining had anything to do with it. She suddenly stopped in her tracks when she noticed the slight shake of Izuku's shoulders, like he was waiting to be punted out of the alcove, or even worse off the roof itself. If Izuku had been looking at her, he would see the almost soft, regretful look grow on her face as she realized she had made him think he was unwelcome. Hey, kid, I didn't mean that in a bad way. I was just surprised these fools adopted a new one. The last stray they picked up was Shouta here. And he's such a grumpy, but I didn't expect another one to come around so soon," she explained, sheepish under the heavy, quirk-supported glare that Aizawa was pinning her down with. Izuku sat for a moment, a bit surprised, before nodding sheepishly as he avoided eye contact with a simple sign sorry toward them all. All of them immediately reassured him there was no need to apologize. Before the conversation topics switched fluidly and they all dug into their lunches. Izuku took a minute to get the urge to stim out of his system by drumming his fingers against his right thigh, before shaking off the feelings and looking up to catch up to their conversation and start his own lunch. He nearly jumped out of his skin, however, when instead of them all doing their own thing, Yamada was looking at him intently. Izuku and him made awkward eye contact for a moment, before Yamada offered a small smile and looked back to Midnight, who was talking about how this girl in her class tried to slut-shame her before Midnight beat her ass during training. "Oh, talking about training," Shirakumo suddenly announced loudly, "Yagi, you're joining us for afternoon training, right? You don't have any more hell tests to do." Izuku hummed quietly, trying to test if his voice was back yet, and was only mildly disappointed to find it wasn't. He raised his hands to sign, before realizing he didn't know if Shirakumo knew it, settling for a nod and small smile. Shirakumo glanced at where his hands made a half-aborted attempt to raise, before saying, "We all know sign, by the way. Yamajude over here is deaf, so if you ever need to sign instead of speak you can." Izuku glanced over at Yamada, mildly surprised by the sudden announcement. Yamada just grinned and moved his head to the side to show the hearing aid in his ear, proudly announcing, "Deaf for 12 years and counting." Aizawa rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath about "Of course you're still counting, moron. It won't exactly go away." Izuku smiled gratefully at the two of them, before signing, "Thank you for telling me. I am joining afternoon training. Though I wonder if he'll have me do an assessment test instead of whatever the rest of you are doing." Shirakumo grinned excitedly. "Yeah, he probably will. On the first day of school he had us go through all these tests you do in middle school, except he let us use our quirks to help us out. It was super cool, except for the threat of someone going home if they didn't take it seriously enough. That was less cool, more scary." Izuku had to physically restrain himself from laughing aloud. So Aizawa got his dirty first day trick from Nenzu, huh? He somehow wasn't surprised by this revelation. Aizawa grumbled under his breath a little before muttering, "It's great for everybody with an offensive quirk. Anybody who doesn't have a powerful, heroic quirk is just doing quirkless assessment tests like always." Yamada and Shirakumo both groaned at the same time. This was clearly a recurring topic, which was absolutely hilarious to Izuku, who knew for absolute fact Aizawa adopts the very strategy that he apparently hates so much. "What is your quirk, by the way?" "Mine's voice. I can be super loud basically. Aburo here can make clouds, and Sho can erase other people's quirks when they look at someone." "Don't forget about me," Nimuri hissed under her breath. "I can make people fall asleep with a gas I can make from my skin. It works best on straight men and gay women though." She nearly purred, becoming much more like the R-rated hero he remembered. Izuku snorted quietly at the memory before responding. "It's an energy stockpile quirk. It presents as super strength right now, but as I train it, there might be a chance it could manifest in different ways." Yamada grinned, bouncing slightly at the revelation. "That's so super cool, dude. Imagine all the things you could do with that. How does it work?" Izuku felt his throat loosen up at the excitement he showed and the genuine interest on the others' faces. And he couldn't help the smile and slight bounce he did in return as he started to ramble about his quirk. It's like this massive buildup of energy and power. Whenever I use it, you see these red lines on my arms, and when I channel it through my whole body there's this green lightning that goes off. I was a pretty late bloomer. There were these weird requirements for it to develop, so by the time it manifested I had stockpiled a bunch of energy for it. I can only use about 20% of it right in now. If I use any more it breaks my bones, and I have to switch to using my legs in fights because of the damage it left in my arms. But it's getting better." He stuttered out excitedly. The more he talked, the more he bounced or moved his arms. He completely missed the look Shirakumo was giving Aizawa, who was blushing and avoiding looking directly at Izuku, or the way Yamada had a big grin on his face and appeared as if he couldn't look away. And that's how the rest of the lunch period went. With Yamada or Shirakumo spurring Izuku on his tangents to open him up more, Yamada followed his movements with just as much passion. Aizawa was unable to look at him for more than a few seconds without feeling fire burning on his cheek, and Shirakumo barely restrained his laughter at Izuku's oblivion of the two boys who were looking at him as if he was carved by the gods themselves. Meanwhile, Midnight was slowly realizing that the boy with white hair and a blinding grin was off limits by the way he already had Aizawa and Yamada wrapped around his little finger. Nobody really knew it at the time, but the rooftop gang had just gained a new member, and everything would be changed because of it. Izuku was startled out of his current ramble, one on All Might in the foundation that was built around his symbol of peace, by the distant sound of the bell ringing. He paused when the entire group suddenly jumped to their feet as if they were burned. But he realized not a full second later that they were nowhere near their classrooms, and that the walk was most definitely not meant to be fit in between the first and the last bell. They sprinted blindly down the hallways, and Shirakumo managed to wheeze out a small "trust me, you don't want to be late for Nedzu's class." If it was anything like Aizawa's homeroom, he believed him wholeheartedly. Izuku had, at some point in the mad sprint for their lives, activated a low level of OFA, leaving the others in the dust as they tried and failed to catch up with him. Izuku entered the classroom a solid 15 seconds earlier than the rest of them, with the other three entering the classroom and rushing to their seats just as the final bell rang, dirty glares on their faces and sweat beading down their necks by the looks of exasperation their classmates gave them. This wasn't as uncommon an occurrence as Shirakumo had tried to make him believe. Just as the three of them collapsed, Nedzu popped up from behind the desk. Izuku would have been startled had he not had Aizawa for homeroom, who was particularly fond of popping out of thin air to startle his students into constant vigilance and better spatial awareness. Just on time, Nedzu laughed, his smile less of a smile and more of a toothy grin. "Make sure you get here a little bit before the late bell, all right, boys?" The four of them immediately shivered and nodded furiously, ignoring the small coughs and snorts the other students let out at their shaking. Nedzu just smiled again, very distinctly not comforting like, "Well, now that everybody is here, we can begin. Today will be quirked sparring against a partner of your choosing. After 2 rounds, you'll switch partners. Now that there's 12 of us, there will be even pairs, and nobody will have to pair up with me." The sudden palpable relief that flooded the room made Izuku jump a little. "Apparently, you don't want to spar with Nedzu. He'll keep that one in mind. Yagi, normally I would have you do an assessment, but I trust your previous homeroom teacher well enough that I'll let it slide. At the end of the period, I want you to go to the support labs and submit your design for your costume. They'll get it done for you soon." Izuku nodded, and the class started filing out the doors after grabbing their costume cases while Izuku got his gym uniform from Nedzu's desk. As they got to the locker room, Izuku found an empty locker near the other three and stripped off his uniform without thinking too heavily on it. He had just taken off his button-up when a quiet gasp distracted him. He turned and looked and saw Yamada looking directly at the lines, and starbursts littered across his back once he turned. Yamada paled dramatically at the full extent. Izuku wasn't ashamed of his scars. He wasn't exactly proud of them, per se, but he definitely wasn't embarrassed by them, which is why he surprised himself by flinching back when Yamada moved towards him slightly, minutely, but still noticeable by the way Yamada paused and looked up at him. "Dude, where did you get those?" he murmured. His expression was unreadable, but the pale tint to his skin said enough. Izuku paused. He could go with the answer Tsukushima gave him, that he was in witness protection and couldn't tell them, but it wasn't really true in this case. This was just good old-fashioned bullying, nothing to do with time travel. Plus, they had all been so welcoming. The least he could do is tell them a half-truth. He laughed sheepishly and rubbed the back of his neck, accidentally exposing another scar on his ribs. By this time, both Aizawa and Shirakumo were watching him as well, watching with a worrying mix of concern, anger, and distress. "Ah, well, you know how I said I was a late bloomer," he said sheepishly, looking away from them almost shyly as he unfolded his gym uniform. They all nodded, none of them understanding, and Izuku winced internally at having to spell it out. "Well, I was a really late bloomer. Like, I didn't get my quirk until I was 14, late. There was this weird activation requirement and everything. But regardless, for the first 14 years of my life, people thought I was quirkless. I was a false negative." He scowled slightly as he looked down, grabbing his gym shirt and pulling it on. "Let's just say nobody likes the quirkless kid. The boy who used to be my best friend did most of this. His quirk lets him make explosions from his sweat. And I got in his way a lot. Some of them came from the other students, and the ones on my hands are from my quirk. But most of them. He wasn't a good person for a long time." He stripped off his uniform pants, grateful for the long boxers he wore that covered the harder to explain away scars he's left, and pulled on the gym pants while they processed what he had said. By the time he looked up, Aizawa was pale and had a murderous glint to his eyes. Yamada looked like he was ready to either burst into tears or burst someone's eardrums from how loud he wanted to scream. And Shirakumo seemed to be in shock, a sad look in his eyes as he looked absently at where he knew the scars lay. "I mean, it's not a big deal," he mumbled hurriedly. "I was creepy, and the teachers never told them it was wrong, so they didn't understand that it wasn't okay or that I was a person too, especially my old friend." That seemed to make it worse if the way all three of them suddenly whipped their heads towards him meant anything. "Dude," Shirakumo said slowly, "that's not okay. It doesn't matter if nobody told him it was wrong, which is a whole other concern. By the way, it still doesn't make it all right that he left scars. And so many it looks like you've been a pro for over a decade. But you're younger than us." Izuku rubbed the back of his neck again in a nervous tick, shifting to tuck his hair away from his eyes before bouncing lightly on his toes. "Can we drop it?" We're going to be late if we don't go." Aizawa didn't look at him, but he turned around and started putting his hero costume on. He noted that it was remarkably similar to the one he had as an adult. No visible differences in it except the shape and color of the goggles. Shirakumo's costume was super cool and well suited for his personality, and Yamada's was also mostly the same, save the lack of a directional speaker and a different style of jacket. Overall, Izuku wasn't very surprised but still found it awesome to see them looking like such pros. They all headed out, not really talking much until one of the girls Izuku hasn't met yet came up to him with something in her hand. She was kind-looking, with dark hair and eyes and no visible quirk. "She smiles like Uraraka." A small voice whispered in his head. It was already getting easier to ignore the pangs in the bottom part of his chest. "Hey, Yagi, right. I noticed your hair is pretty long, and it can be annoying to spar with your hair on your face. So I have a hair tie for you if you want it." He had been worried about that. The thought of having to fight with his hair in his eyes was frustrating at the least. But his hair products wouldn't be coming in until this afternoon. He thanked her as he took it from her, and looked down at the band with a barely concealed confusion on his face. Yamada snorted quietly, the first sound he's made since the locker room, and moved forward. "Here, let me help. I've had so many foster sisters I can't even begin to count them all." Izuku handed the tie off to him and turned around, letting him start to fiddle with his hair. He had expected Yamada to just pull it into a ponytail, but instead he gathered the hair at the top of his head into sections and started braiding his hair into a plait. "It'll be better in a braid than pulled back in a ponytail, especially if you're not used to having your hair back," Yamada explained. "It'll give you a headache if you go straight into pulling your hair into tight buns. A braid will keep it back out of your face and won't hurt your scalp." He tied off the end of it with a snap and let out a pleased hum, and he looked at his work. "Plus, you're kinda cute with your hair back like that." Izuku felt his face turn scarlet as he sputtered so hard he felt like his brain was rebooting. That was unexpected. He heard Shirakumo cackle and Aizawa huff quietly, but it took a good couple of seconds for his brain to stop blue screening. Yamada had a strange glint in his eyes as he watched Izuku buffer. But before anyone could say anything else, Nedzu clapped his paws together at the front of the gym. "Everyone partner up," he cried out cheerfully. Shirakumo grabbed Yamada by the ear and dragged him over to a mat, excitedly talking about a new move he learned, so Izuku turned to Aizawa. "Want to partner?" Aizawa, oddly enough, blushed a little before nodding. They went and claimed the mat next to the other two, who were already knee-deep into their match, pieces of cloud scattering every which way from the blasts of sound splitting the air. Aizawa got into a fighting stance. But before he could even blink, Izuku was on his side of the mat, ramming him in the stomach with his shoulder as he knocked him onto his back. Aizawa struggled to get out of his grasp. But even without his quirk, Izuku was stronger than him by a long shot. Pinning his hands under his knees, Izuku pressed one hand on his chest with the other wrapped around his neck, not squeezing, but still showing a clear win. After a second, Izuku released him, a small smile on his face as he offered his hand out to Aizawa to help him up. Aizawa laid on the mat recovering for a minute, but eventually accepted the hand and stood. "Where the hell did you learn to do that? I thought you were a first-year student before today." Izuku laughed and scuffed his shoes on the mat, looking away shyly. "My old teacher, he was pretty strict. He was really fond of making us do quirkless sparring. And the whole there's no start in battle thing. I learned how to be quick, whether my quirk is reliable at the moment or not." Aizawa just let out a quiet laugh and shook his head, getting back into battle stance. This time Aizawa made the first move, his quirk activated almost immediately and his capture weapon lashing out at Izuku's leg. Izuku noticed that he wasn't nearly as proficient with it as he was in the future, which was understandable but still pretty amusing when he fumbled with it. Strangely enough, it took a bit of adjusting to get used to the Aizawa who has had his capture scarf for less than a year compared to the Aizawa who has had it for a decade and a half. The weapon wrapped around his calf and dropped him to the mat hard, but just as Aizawa rushed forward to pin him, Izuku lashed out with his free leg to knock his dominant ankle out from underneath him, shifting to his knees and moving to pin his arms like he did before. Before he could fully pin him, however, Aizawa kicked his leg up and kneed him in the groin, making Izuku grunt in pain as he was flipped and pinned. "Thanks for the lesson on pinning," Aizawa snarled, his lips pulled back in a ferocious grin, his knees on Izuku's hands and his arms on either side of Izuku's head. Ignoring the weird feeling in his chest, he let out a loud, barking laugh and snarled right back up at him. "Good try, Aizawa, but you forgot one thing." Aizawa's face dropped into confusion, but before he could ask, Izuku had jerked his left leg out, tangling it around Aizawa's thigh and using it as leverage to roll over so Aizawa was thoroughly tangled underneath the man. Aizawa felt his entire face light up like it was on fire as Izuku leaned in close, a new glint in his eyes as he bared his teeth at him. "I'm a lot heavier. What works for me won't necessarily work for you." Aizawa's flush creeped down his neck, and Izuku let out another laugh, one far more gentle and kind as he leaned back and offered his hand out again. He accepted it after a moment of hesitation, strange, new feelings buzzing in his chest like a swarm of angry bees, and was pulled to his feet easily. "So how would you recommend I pin someone bigger than me?" he asked, part of him genuinely curious and the other part kind of wanting to be pinned again. Izuku's face went from manic joy to a sunshine-wise smile in less than a second, and he immediately started bouncing up and down in excitement. Oh, that's easy. I used to be real short and scrawny before I had a growth spurt. I can definitely help you with that." As Izuku explained what Aizawa would want to do for larger opponents, neither noticed the two sets of eyes on them from the neighboring mat. Yamada watched with a small blush on his ears, listening as Izuku explained the how-to of the technique, and Shirakumo just glanced between the three of his friends with a small grin on his face. It was rare to see Aizawa looking at someone like that. In fact, the only other person Shirakumo has seen him look like that towards was his sparring partner himself. Shirakumo watched as Izuku demonstrated the move on Aizawa before letting him try it out to get a feel for it. They would all be awfully cute together. He wondered how they would react to a certain love expert he knows poking their heads in. His fingers rolled over his phone lightly, and he couldn't help the small laugh that bubbled out as he thought of Kayama's interventions. This was going to be fun. Finally, after the third time of Aizawa trying the pin, he finally managed to keep Izuku down, and Shirakumo couldn't help but let out a quiet snort at the sight of Aizawa's small, proud grin as Izuku flopped like a fish out of water to test Aizawa's hold. "That's so much better. Are you ready to switch partners?" Izuku giggled once he had been released. They both turned and glanced at Shirakumo and Yamada to see if they were done, and Izuku smiled brightly when he saw they were. Aizawa nodded, the small smile not leaving his face as he turned towards them. Shirakumo all but leapt forward and grabbed Izuku by the arm, pulling him to the mat. "I want to turn with Mr. Strong Arms," he crowed, pushing him to one side of the mat and placing himself firmly on the other. Aizawa rolled his eyes good-naturedly and went to the other side of the mat Shirakumo had been on moments before, waiting for Yamada to make the first move. Shirakumo let himself grin widely as he waited for Izuku to make the first move. In his match against Aizawa, he hadn't used his quirk because of his knowledge on Aizawa's, but against Shirakumo all's fair in love and war. Just as he finished that thought, Izuku's entire body lit up with green lightning, his eyes shining with a toxic light and his braid rolling like the ocean from the waves of energy coming off of him. Shirakumo felt himself hesitate for no more than a second, shocked at the sudden display of power. But that was all Izuku needed to press forward and aim a super-powered kick to Shirakumo's head. Shirakumo immediately ducked and rushed to Izuku's open side to try and get a jab in. But before he could so much as blink, Izuku was behind Shirakumo, the only cue being the green lightning flickering along the edges of his vision, grabbing his shoulder with his hands and swiping his foot out harshly. He didn't so much as breathe before he was on the mat hard. He laughed loudly, overjoyed at his new sparring partner. "Dude, where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" Izuku giggled back, helping Shirakumo to his feet, and he brushed his hands along his pants. "I cleaned a beach." Shirakumo paused from brushing imaginary dirt off his jacket to look up at him, confused at the sudden topic change. "You cleaned a beach?" "Yeah," Izuku responded, another shy smile on his face. "I cleaned an illegal dumping ground that used to be a beach for 10 months, and then my old homeroom teacher absolutely pounded fighting techniques into my class's head because..." He cut himself off, looking down a bit. "Because of the circumstances our class was in. It's also why I have my provisional license, and why I'm with your class." Shirakumo felt his face heat up a little bit in embarrassment from the accidentally invasive question. "Sorry, I shouldn't have asked." He trailed off sheepishly. "No, it's okay," Izuku hurriedly responded. The reason I'm in this class is because I'm in witness protection." "It's you can't know yet." He murmured the last part, his own neck heating up. It wasn't time. He couldn't dump that all on people he just met. Yamada and Aizawa, who definitely haven't paused their sparring to watch Izuku beat their friend's ass, chimed in here. "You don't have to tell us anything you're not ready for," Yamada said, his voice partially drowning out Aizawa, who said something along the lines of not being so anxious all the damn time. Izuku just smiled weakly. "I do want to be able to talk about it, just not yet." They all responded in some sort of affirmative, and sparring was back in gear. Izuku lost the second round against Shirakumo, who used his clouds as a cover to sneak behind Izuku and pin him by the time they were done discussing what they could have done differently. Natsu called out for Izuku to change and head to the support department. He said goodbye to his new friends before skittering off to the locker rooms to change back into his uniform. Unbeknownst to him, Shirakumo was currently being pummeled to the ground by Yamada, who was all but distraught he didn't get to spar with the new boy. Aizawa just grumbled something about them being immature as they wrestled on the ground. But Shirakumo didn't miss the way he watched Izuku leave. Pathetic, the lot of them. Izuku, on the other hand, was currently walking up to the support department, thinking over what he wanted his new costume to look like. The never-ending green and red didn't make as much sense now that he had white hair. and he was kind of scared he would look like a knockoff Santa, so maybe he could go with a bunny theme. The ears on his old costume did have a very bunny-like appearance, and with his bouncing fighting style it would make sense maybe he could take that concept and run with it. It would help to be cute appearing, especially if he went underground. Just as he was beginning the debate on the pros and cons of a short fluffy tail being added, he suddenly had the overwhelming urge to duck and cover, never one to ignore that alarm, especially around the support labs after his first mistake. He took shelter behind a corner just as the door exploded off its hinges, slamming against the spot Izuku had been standing no less than 4 seconds ago. For a split second, he had a terribly familiar memory of Mei doing this frequently enough to have her own code. This deja vu was only strengthened when a familiar voice yelled in exhausted Hatsum, almost wailing about the cost of doors and insurance. It's a vital part of the process. A voice called out. That broke him out of his stupor. It wasn't Mei. This voice, while still slightly feminine, was much lower than Mei's ever has been. Slowly creeping over the rubble, he saw a display that made his heart positively ache. Wearing the support department uniform was a more feminine-presenting person with brown dreads running down their back, a pair of goggles strapped on their head, and absolutely covered in soot, the only clean spots seen being circles around their eyes. The eyes snapped over to Izuku, and a manic grin covered their face. A newbie. Yes, what are you here for? Support items, a costume, both. They screeched joyfully, flinging themselves across the room. They would have nearly tackled Izuku, had a hand not caught them mid-jump. Looking over, Izuku saw a boy, a little taller than the person with dreads, with wild pink hair sticking up in all directions and tired yellow eyes that had very familiar crosshairs. Izuku immediately knew who Hatsum's parents were, and couldn't help the small smile as the boy scolded them about manners and patience. As the two argued between themselves, something about not tackling new students, he glanced over just in time to see Nana looking up at him. Her eyes immediately crinkled up in a wide smile, and he couldn't help but smile back at her. She seemed to be working on wiring for a large metal contraption scattered in several pieces along her workspace, and it didn't take very long for her to get absorbed back into her work. The argument was interrupted as they finally just rolled their eyes before grabbing Izuku's arm and dragging him off to their station. Don't mind Suzuki. He's a spoilsport. My name is Hatsumama, them please. I'm a third year, and if you're here for a costume and support items, we're the people for you. Izuku smiled faintly with more memories of a pink-haired tornado whipping through the support wing like she was born there. At least he knows now that he wasn't that far off. I'm Yagi Izuku. I'm a second-year hero course student. I came to get a costume designed, support course items drafted, and everything submitted. The manic gleam grew tenfold in Hatsum's eyes, and he heard a groan from the front. Glancing to the front of the room, the young version of Powerloader had his head down on the desk with everything he owned covered by a thick layer of soot. He really deserves a raise, especially considering who will be in his class in 15 years' time. If he thought the first one was bad, just wait till the second one comes along. Hatsum cheered, and together they started drafting out his costume ideas. Hatsum was just like their child in the means of wanting to add everything to a support item and was only held in check by Suzuki, who was the one who had to do the wiring and welding in any invention Hatsum determines necessary. After a long period of discussion on his costume ideas, quirk, and fighting style, they determined that while the bunny theme would be cute and cuddly for victims, it would do absolutely no good in just about any other situation. He needed to be taken seriously. He had seen how Aizawa was treated when they didn't know he was a hero, and he wasn't very interested in following his footsteps. Thank you very much. Since he was going underground, they decided a thick, tight-fitting back tank top-style jumpsuit for his underlayer would be a good layer between him and being stabbed. He was hesitant on showing his arms off, but Hatsum took one look at his arms through his uniform and said that it was a crime against humanity to wear anything baggy or long-sleeved. He ended up too flustered to disagree any further. Suzuki said that he liked the idea of the gloves storing power and helping his quirk, but the bulky design wouldn't help with quick fights and movements like he would need, so a quick redesign left him with black full-fingered gloves, tight and with copper material infused in them to help with his pain. It wouldn't propel his quirk any, but with the signs of pre-arthritis they decided they didn't want to risk anything. For his outer layer, he would be given thick, black pants, not quite baggy but not skin-tight to give him a bit more movement options, and a jacket he could wear during the colder seasons or if he needed any extra protection for a mission. His boots were plain black with steel toes and shock-absorbent soles, and after a while of convincing from Hatsum they agreed to adding springs and air-powered jump accelerators to boost his already powerful movements without overusing his quirk. With a few hidden knives for emergencies, a first aid kit in his utility belt, and some other minor details, they were finally set. It wasn't a lot compared to other heroes, but he didn't need a lot. Almost giddy with excitement for his new costume, he walked out of the building and was surprised to see Yamada, Aizawa, and Shirokuma waiting on the steps. They turned around when they heard the door open, and Yamada and Shirakumo instead broke out into grins. Aizawa just glanced at him, but for him that might as well have been a warm hug. "You're finally done," Shirakumo crowed, jumping up from his place and spreading his arms out in joy. "That took forever." He paused suddenly and looked at Izuku with squinted eyes. "Hatsum talked to you, didn't they?" Izuku laughed, loud and sweet, and nodded his head. "Yeah, it was Hatsum. I had to talk them out of giving me a bunch of other support items, and we couldn't decide on my theme, so it took a while." Yamada barked out a laugh and stood up himself, stretching his legs out a little. He turned and dragged Aizawa to his feet, who grumbled the whole time, but followed them down the stairs regardless. "Why did you guys wait?" Izuku asked. "It was Aizawa's idea," Shirakumo said, that sly smile on his face again. "We were walking past your dorm building and we saw dozens of packages in your name." Aizawa explained that all of the wards get cards sponsored from the commission. "Lucky, by the way, and that you probably bought a bunch of stuff for your apartment. It looked like a lot to do by yourself, so we decided to stay back and ask if we could help out." Izuku paused, before kicking himself back into gear with a shake of his head as he laughed brightly. "You all are too much. I've only known you for a day. If you want to help me set up furniture and put clothes away for hours, then yeah, feel welcome. I have to run to the grocery store later to get some stuff for the apartment. If you wanted, you could tag along." He paused, a more cheeky grin sliding onto his face. "It's the commission's money, and it's my single goal in life to spend as much of their cash as I can." Yamada let out another laugh louder than the first one, and Aizawa flashed a glowing red glare his way to shut him up. "Dude, who knew the shy kid was so evil?" Izuku just huffed, not bothering to grace him with a response. It was easier now that he was more comfortable around them since wasn't associating them with his teachers. It almost reminded him of his friends. He cut off that train of thought suddenly, frowning at himself. "They're not your friends anymore. Most of them haven't even been born yet." Aizawa growled and smacked the back of Yamada's head. "Don't say stupid things," he hissed, red eyes glaring Yamada down as he waved his hands frantically in front of himself. Whenever the quirk again let up, he immediately stuttered out an apology. But Izuku just waved him off. "It's all right. I was just reminded of my old friends. I forgot where I was for a second." Izuku smiled at him to try and make him feel a little better, but he knew his smile was small and nostalgic rather than big and comforting. Yamada just blushed and rubbed the back of his head. "Still, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to bring up memories." "What were they like?" Shirakumo asked. Aizawa went to smack him too, but Izuku told him it was all right. "They were loud," he huffed. So loud. I mean, one of them, he was such a stickler for the rules. He basically worshipped the ground our homeroom teacher walked on. Sensei hated it. The poor man just wanted to sleep. You would think he would be a spoilsport, but when it came down to the nitty and gritty, he was one of the first people to drop everything he trusted to save someone. He was polite, loyal, and such a good person. And once Kami taught him how to have a sense of humor, he was actually pretty funny. He was great at sarcasm. None of us could ever tell the difference. This other one, she was so bubbly and kind it could make you happy just being near her. It was contagious. She had this awesome way of making you forget whatever you were sad or angry about and making you laugh instead. She took one of her internships with a fighting hero, even though she once wanted to be a rescue hero, because she lost a fight to one of the strongest dudes in our class and she was pissed about it. When she came back, she was one of the best hand-to-hand fighters, other than the few who had been training for years, and definitely wasn't afraid to use it to her advantage. This one time, she took this pervert in our class who tried to grope one of the other girls and straight up punted him out of the window. He paused, laughing at the memory of watching Minda fly out of the window with a quirk-enhanced punt from a furious girl. Our homeroom teacher just closed his eyes and let it happen. The girls treated her like a queen for weeks. He was terrified of her after that. This other guy, he was aggressive, to say the least. He didn't always mean well. He used to be a pretty shitty person actually, but he changed in the last few months we were together. He wasn't nice, by any stretch of the word, but he cared about everybody so much. He showed it in a weird way, but he was trying so hard, and he was my first friend. He'll always have a special place in my heart." He paused, his laughter dying down a little bit. "I wonder how he's doing." Aizawa sighed a little before patting his back. "I'm sure he's okay. Besides, if you say he was changing, I'm sure he's doing well for himself. Anyone who sees that they're wrong and makes an actual effort to change deserves a second chance." Izuku smiled, his eyes glossing over a little. "Yeah, he does." He did. When they reached the dorms, Izuku had told them his favorite memories from his old class, heavily edited of course. He told them about how the first time Bakugo cooked, the whole class almost died from the spices and Kaminari actually passed out from it. How Sato would accidentally bribe people into being his friend by giving them treats and then feel awful for it afterwards because he thought he was being manipulative. How Takoyami would always act like this big, bad, scary emo, but when Izuku caught a glimpse into his room, he had a Sailor Moon poster on his wall and was listening to Billie Eilish of all people. how Gyro basically carried them on her back the entirety of the school festival, how his homeroom teacher would just sleep behind the desk the entire period, but if anyone had a question or someone was being a dick he would be there in less than a second, how he rescued Koda's spirit and body, about Eri and her love of candied apples, everything he could think of. He thought at first that reliving the moments with his friends would be hard and remind him about everything he lost. But it didn't. He remembered how happy they all were, and felt almost lighter from it. Together, they laughed at the stupid stories as Izuku reminisced. They let him ramble about how kind everyone was, and how good of heroes they would be as they assembled furniture. It wasn't easy, and Yamada kept fucking up the assembly process somehow, but it was fun. More fun than Izuku remembers having in a long time. When they got to the clothes, nobody said anything about the 2 skirts or the more feminine tops. In fact, Yamada said that he wishes he had half of the stuff he had bought. They were some of the most accepting people he had ever had the pleasure of meeting, and it brought a warm feeling to his chest as he watched Yamada and Aizawa roll around wrestling over who got to help Izuku go to the grocery store before Izuku interrupted and said they could all come. The walk to the store consisted of the 3 of them telling stories about their first year, how Aizawa was in Gen Ed for their first year until he kicked everyone's ass at the sports festival, how Shirakumo has the world's biggest crush on Kayama but won't tell her even though she obviously likes you back, doofus, how Yamada broke all the windows in the classroom when he saw a bug and passed out when it flew by his ear. It was comfortable, and by the time they got to the store, Izuku felt like he had known them his whole life rather than a day. Izuku picked out some of his favorites for the apartment, plus some new stuff he had never heard of but one of the other 3 would convince him was absolutely delicious and you have to try it. Really though, the 4 of them were just having a ball spending commission money if the glint in their eyes had anything to say for it. By the time they got back to the dorm, it was getting dark outside. They helped Izuku put away all of the groceries even though he told them he could do it perfectly fine by himself before Yamada and Shirakumo said goodbye and left for their houses. Him and Aizawa sat on the couch for a while, alternating between playing Mario Kart on the new gaming console and chatting about whatever was on their minds. And by the time they were tired of it, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Aizawa bid Izuku a goodnight before trudging to his room across the hall, a small smile on his face that Izuku almost missed. He looked down at his new phone and felt a large grin cross his face. Whenever they saw he had bought a phone, they all put their number in it, plus Kayama's, and added him to a group chat called the Rooftop Gang with all of them plus an additional person that hasn't texted yet. It was the most at peace he's felt since this whole thing happened. And when Izuku fell asleep that night, the only thing on his mind was his newfound friends and how lucky he was to have been put in their class. Izuku opened his eyes, but instead of his ceiling, everything was completely dark. Sitting up and looking around to try to see what was happening, he saw a faint light shining from the end of a long hallway. He got up and started making his way towards it, cautious steps and light breaths. A loud thump came from behind him, and he froze. Slow footsteps started towards him, and he took off. The footsteps got clearer as he ran, with the shine growing brighter and brighter the closer he got until it was nearly blinding. He finally entered into the light, and was nearly knocked over with surprise when he saw himself in the common room of his old dorms. He looked around, and sure enough, all of his classmates were there. 1A, guys, what's going on? He said, walking up to the couch where Uraraka sat. Ada and Sue on either side of her, comforting her while she cried. Uraraka, what's happening? Why didn't he say anything? She sobbed, her voice rough from tears. How could he just leave like that? Who left? Izuku asked, getting desperate as people continued to ignore him. What's happening? Maybe Mido didn't want to leave, Sue croaked, her own eyes glossy from unshed tears. We don't know what happened. Ada nodded along with Sue, rubbing Uraraka's back as she continued to sob. I'm right here, what are you talking about? Guys, I'm right here. TCH, what are you guys talking about? That nerd probably left because he was too good for us. He was always so sure he was better than everybody else. Bakugo's red eyes turned and looked directly at Izuku, burning and hot. This wasn't the Kacchan who wanted to be better. This was the Kacchan that bullied him, burned his things after classes as a power trip. This was the Kacchan that told him to kill himself. Isn't that right, Deku? Are you too good for us? Had to go and find some other friends that are more on your level. And no, Kacchan, I never thought I was too good for you. I've always put you above me, please. Bakugo's face warped until it was the young version Aizawa staring at him with a fierce snarl, a face Izuku only knew from the USJ and training camps. Who do you think you are, barging in here and acting like we're friends? You'll never be good enough for us. You're not even telling us the truth about who you are. Gah. I know, you're what? He mocked, his voice warping as if there were 2 of him and his eyes shining a brilliant red. You're good enough. Yeah, Which one is it then, nerd? Are you too good for us or not good enough? Bakugo snarled, leaning down over him next to Aizawa. When did they get so tall they were warped and hateful, and Izuku felt smaller than he had since he was quirkless? Well, Deku, Naga Izuku. Wake up, someone yelled at him, a hand holding his arm from where it had been shielding his head. Izuku shot awake all at once, scrambling away from the figure leaning over the side of his bed. And no, please don't, not again, I can't, mindless please fell from his lips as he shuddered, clutching his hair tightly to try and ground himself. The figure crawled up on his bed silently, and held their hands out in a placating manner. Yagi, Izuku, I'm not going to hurt you. It's Aizawa. You're at the dorms on UA campus. This is your room. We just finished setting everything up today with Shirakumo and Yamada. You're safe, he stressed. Izuku looked up, his breath ragged and short. Aizawa. Aizawa sighed in relief. Yeah, it's me. It's just me. Izuku let out a short keen, burying his face into his knees. Why you? Hey, it's okay. Don't stress about it. We all get nightmares. I don't live on campus because my home life was sunshines and rainbows, he added with a touch of strained sarcasm. Izuku choked on a laugh, tears still streaming down his face. Sorry, didn't mean to wake you. You're all right. I'm a light sleeper when I sleep at all, that is. The amount of times I've been woken up by Nana breaking one thing or another is ridiculous and completely illogical. Izuku let out another quiet laugh, the tears and shaking starting to subside gently. Still, he murmured, I'm not important enough to be disturbing you. Aizawa hesitated. Izuku was clearly half asleep and distressed, which is the only reason he would be talking like that. He should just tuck him in and go back to his dorm. But, what do you mean? He asked quietly. I'm just some Deku. Don't need to be bothering your sleep or anything. Aizawa paused. There's that word again, Deku. Yagi had muttered something along those lines when he was still having the nightmare, but he hadn't thought anything of it. Doesn't that mean useless? He asked hesitantly. Izuku yawned, already on his way back to sleep. Yeah, useless. She tried to reclaim it for me, told me it could mean I can do it, but they always knew. I was just a waste of space. Aizawa paused, listening as Izuku's breathing evened out. He silently tucked the comforter up, before watching him for a moment. He had tear tracks down his face, and his hair was still in the braid Hisashi had put it in, albeit messier. This boy was something like he had never seen before, but all he could do is be there for him and hope he opens up eventually. For now, it's time to go back to bed and hope Yaga's sleep is more restful. When Yamada went to school the morning of September 5th, he didn't know what he was expecting outside of the normal 2sh tick. Nedzu's near-constant manic energy while threatening all of them with expulsion, death at a minimum of 8 times. Absolutely. Nimuri flirting with Oboro until he was all but steaming at the ears during lunch. You betcha. A new kid. Not unheard of, though highly unlikely and definitely not on his mind. Aizawa knowing the new kid, being almost friendly with him. Impossible. Oboro had been talking about whatever it is Oboro likes to talk about, when Aizawa suddenly elbowed him in the ribs as a cue to stop yammering. He glanced over at him to see Aizawa looking intently at something across the hall, focused and damn near concerned underneath the exterior numbness he projected. When Yamada turned his head to look at what he was staring at, he swears he felt his heart stutter to a stop in his chest. It wasn't too early to be pining, apparently. Standing there, looking like a deer in the headlights under the 3 sets of eyes staring at him, was one of the cutest boys Yamada has ever laid his eyes on. He meets a lot of cute boys in UA, but this one was someone he knew he hadn't seen before. He would remember a face like that. He took a second to gawk. His hair was wavy, reaching a bit past his shoulders, and was one of the purest white colors he's ever seen in somebody's hair. He had a splattering of freckles decorating his entire face and neck and a cute blush on his cheeks, with a beautiful shade of light gray eyes, where Aizawa's eyes were like a dark storm, threatening to take over your life and encompass you in everything. His eyes were like the clouds after the thunderstorm finally rolled away. Peaceful, almost. He was a pretty decent height, probably around 58 or 59. But didn't look like he was very used to it if the way he shrunk in on himself said anything. Yamada's favorite part of the boy, however, were the muscles he could see through the outline of his shirt, unlike Aizawa, who was skin and bones despite trying to get better eating and sleeping habits, or Oboro, who was a speed fighter who worked on agility, or even Yamada, who focused on long-distance fighting. This boy clearly worked his muscles for brawn, and his efforts paid off. Yamada felt a little faint at the sight. Hey, are you new? Oboro called out, a bright smile on his face as always. The kid looked like he would pass out at the sudden question directed to him. Aizawa, ever observant, saw his panic and spoke up quickly. He's a new ward, we met yesterday. Yagi, right. Why yeah, Yagi Izuku. I got lost looking for class 2A. He muttered, pointedly not making eye contact. Yamada felt his chest swell with excitement, and all but leapt to talk to him. Hey, that's our class 2. Follow us, Yagi, we'll lead you there. Oboro snorted quietly beside him, and it took everything in him to not elbow him as hard as he could in his side. He smiled a little before nodding, and tailed behind their group like a lost duckling. Yamada continued his walk beside Shirakumo, letting him continue his rant while Aizawa lagged behind and spoke quietly to him. And here we are. he announced, accidentally cutting off whatever Aizawa was going to say. He sheepishly rubbed his neck when he saw it and gave him a dead stare. Yagi thanked him quietly, but he just laughed and brushed it off to avoid the feelings swelling in his chest like a balloon. Just as they stepped in the room, Nezu looked up from where he had been sitting behind his desk with an animalistic grin on his face. Yagi, brilliant timing. I just finished uploading the test you'll be taking. We'll get that set up for you and you can begin. Nezu let out a deranged cackle, and everybody in the room paled a few shades. Dude, he whispered, what did you do to Nezu already? His tests are terrible. Yagi laughed quietly, his voice a little strained, before explaining quietly, I'm skipping a grade, I'm technically still a first year, I guess. Where I come from, the first years already had their provisional licenses, so the principal decided to put me with TUA so I wouldn't be held back. But because of that I have to take an academic placement test to see what classes I'll have to take extra work for. He felt like he was going to pass out. He was a first year, and he was going to die in the pause of Nezu's hell test. He never even got to hold his hand. You're only a first year. You're a baby, Oboro mumbled, his face as pale as he was sure his own was. Yagi blushed scarlet as he quickly scurried away without responding. And they laughed quietly as he avoided eye contact with the three of them. Class was boring, as always, and Yamada found himself daydreaming and staring at Yagi in between notes. He was typing faster than Yagi could think, and would occasionally start mumbling under his breath, dead silent and faster than light. It was amazing to watch, and for a second Yamada considered that maybe he wouldn't die from Nezu's monstrosity. Finally, though, the bell rang for lunch, and Yamada immediately beelined to the boy to tap his shoulder. Dude, watching you take that test was insane, he said as Yagi packed his laptop away. Your fingers were moving so fast. And every once in a while you would start muttering real quiet and fast. Nobody could make out a single word of what you were saying. Yagi laughed awkwardly and looked away quickly. Sorry. I know that was probably distracting. Everybody always yells at me to knock it off when I do that. Sometimes my brain just moves so fast I end up saying it aloud. You know. His brain blue-screened for a moment. Did he think that they were complaining? If anything, it was cute as hell when he mumbled. Who told him that it was a bad thing? No, dude, it's fine, Oboro said, his voice light but his expression a little pinched. We could barely hear you. You didn't distract anybody. And even if we could hear you more, we get it. Sometimes you have to think out loud. Nobody here will judge you for that. Yagi turned scarlet, and he opened and closed his mouth a few times like he was struggling to find his words, but finally just nodded and smiled slightly. He felt his face split into a wide grin. This boy was the cutest person he's ever seen except maybe Aizawa. He was pretty damn cute too. Let's just go to lunch, Aizawa muttered, breaking his thinking. His cheeks were pink, but he didn't think anything of it until Oboro looked between him and Izuku like a ping-pong match, a large grin growing on his face. Yamada himself smiled at the flustered face Aizawa shot at the two of them, and found his heart stuttering a bit at the sight. Yeah, let's go to lunch. You coming, Yagi? Oboro finally said, the grin not slipping once. Yagi nodded and they headed to lunch. The lunch line didn't take long and they headed to their usual spot while discussing their lesson in class. Finally, as they reached the roof door, Oboro silently passed his tray to him. He took it without complaint and waited patiently for him to finish picking the lock. Yagi looked a bit confused, but didn't seem to want to run away, so that was a win to him. After a second of fiddling, Oboro got the doors open, and they filed out onto the roof. It was a bright day, still cold from the winter chill, but not cloudy or snowy, thankfully. He took a deep breath at the biting chill, enjoying the fresh air, before they scurried away from the front of the roof into a little alcove hidden out of the way. Nimuri was already there, and immediately started bitching at them for being so late before she noticed Yagi and cut herself off abruptly. There's who's the new kid, she questioned, looking confused as she took him in. Yagi turned scarlet under the scrutiny, and ducked his head down into his chest, clutching his pants in his fists. He immediately explained he was new in their class, but barely got through the initial reason before Aizawa whacked the back of her head with an aggressive glare and she started whining about hitting a girl. She suddenly stopped in her tracks when she noticed the slight shake of Yaga's shoulders. She frowned, a semi-soft look crossing her face. Hey, kid, I didn't mean that in a bad way. I was just surprised these fools adopted a new one. The last stray they picked up was Shouta here. And he's such a grumpy, but I didn't expect another one to come around so soon, she explained, sheepish looking under the heavy, quirk-supported glare that Aizawa was pinning her down with. Yagi trembled a little before nodding awkwardly, avoiding eye contact as he signed a simple sorry toward them all. All of them immediately reassured him there was no need to apologize. Before the conversation topic switched swiftly and they all started digging into their lunch. Yamada felt his heart shatter a little at the terrified shake in his shoulders, but found himself watching closely as he started drumming his fingers against his thighs, shaking his arms a little subconsciously. Was he trying to to stim. It was so subtle. If Yamada didn't know what to look for, he wouldn't even notice it. He felt his heart ache a bit at the sight of his attempt of subtlety, and made it a point in his head to not hide his own stimming. Maybe he could pressure Aizawa into helping some. He was broken out of his thoughts as he made eye contact with the boy in question. He smiled slightly before turning away and focusing back into what Nimuri was saying. It was a funny story. He wouldn't lie, but he couldn't stop his mind from drifting to the way Izuku looked at him, like he was expecting to be head. Oh, talking about training. Oboro suddenly announced loudly, Yagi, you're joining us for afternoon training, right? You don't have any more hell tests to do. Yagi hummed quietly, almost completely silent, before a small frown crossed his face. He raised his hands in a half-aborted motion, before catching himself and nodding quietly, a small smile on his face. Oboro glanced at where his hands made an instinctual attempt to raise before saying, we all know sign, by the way. Yamajude over here is deaf, so if you ever need to sign instead of speak, you can. Yagi glanced over at him, a semi-surprised look on his face. He just grinned and moved his head to the side to show the hearing aid in his ear, proudly announcing, deaf for 12 years and counting. Aizawa rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath about of course you're still counting, moron, it doesn't go away. Yamada thought he was a spoilsport, but didn't get the chance to reprimand him as Yagi smiled at them and his heart melted, all thoughts about whining melting away. He looked at them with a small grin on his face. Thank you for telling me. I am joining afternoon training, though I wonder if he'll have me do an assessment test instead of whatever the rest of you are doing. Oboro grinned excitedly back. Yeah, he probably will. On the first day of school he had us go through all these tests you do in middle school, except he let us use our quirks to help us out. It was super cool, except for the threat of someone going home if they didn't take it seriously enough. That was less cool, more scary. God, why would he bring that up? He knows how Aizawa gets about that. Aizawa grumbled under his breath a little before muttering, it's great for everybody with an offensive quirk. Anybody who doesn't have a powerful, heroic quirk is just doing quirkless assessment tests like always. The two of them groaned in sync. He's so damn tired of this conversation. What is your quirk, by the way? Mine's voice. I can be super loud basically. Oboro here can make clouds, and Sho can erase other people's quirks when they look at someone. He was sure to change the conversation before Aizawa could get into the topic of quirk discrimination in Japan. Don't forget about me, Nimuri whined. I can make people fall asleep with a gas I can make from my skin. It works best on straight men and gay women though, she added, leaning forward with her typical flirting face. Yaga's face twitched a bit, almost in amusement, before he answered. It's an energy stockpile quirk. It presents as super strength right now, but as I train it, there's a chance it could manifest in different ways according to the doctor. He grinned, bouncing slightly at the revelation. That's so super cool, dude. Imagine all the things you could do with that. How does it work? Yagi immediately started bouncing back, a blinding grin slipping across his face at the question. Clearly quirks were a safe conversation topic, and he was sure to file that away for later. It's like this massive buildup of energy and power. Whenever I use it, you see these red lines on my arms, and when I channel it through my whole body there's this green lightning that goes off. I was a pretty late bloomer. There were these weird requirements for it to develop, so by the time it manifested I had stockpiled a bunch of energy for it. I can only use about 20% of it right in now. If I use any more it breaks my bones, and I have to switch to using my legs in fights because of the damage it left in my arms, but it's getting better. He stuttered out excitedly. The more he talked, the more he bounced or moved his arms. Yamada wasn't sure if he knew how much stimming he was doing, but by the way he had tried to cover the actions up earlier, he sure as hell wasn't going to point it out to him. It was cute. The others just watched with a quiet grin on their faces, and Yamada felt his own excitement grow as Yagi got more enthusiastic. And that's how the rest of the lunch period went, himself and Oboro egging Yagi into infodumping about quirks. Something that was clearly his special interest by the amount of talking he had about it all. Aizawa would look at him occasionally, but mostly just blushed and focused on his lunch. Yamada, on the other hand, couldn't tear his eyes away and watched with an enthusiastic smile and equally excited stimming. He had a feeling that they just made a new friend. Aizawa was a logical man through and through. He followed his schedule and did what he was supposed to do to get where he wanted to go. He knows what he wants. He knows how he'll get there, and it's sure as hell not by making any friends. When he finally made it into the hero course, he thought he made it clear enough he wasn't interested in people. He tried to chase off Yamada and Shirakumo, but the idiots wouldn't leave him alone even after he told them to get out in as plain and simple terms as he knew how. After a while of them ignoring every word of complaint he uttered, however, he found them somehow worming their ways into his cold dead heart, which, unfortunately, wasn't nearly as cold and dead as he wanted it to be. He found himself reluctantly enjoying their company, found himself smiling under his jacket collar at their dumb antics and moronic ideas. He found himself blushing whenever Yamada got up in his personal space, and faintly missing Shirakumo whenever he was absent. It was illogical and strange, and made him feel all gooey in a way he wasn't familiar with, but he almost liked it in a sense. He was logical, first and foremost, which is why when a new kid showed up at the dorms, he knew to leave him be. He remembered what it was like showing up to the dorms, scared and traumatized and angry at the world. He saw it in the kid's eyes. After a basic introduction, he was fully prepared to let him grieve and cry and scream all night long if that's what he needed, sacrificing his own rest for their sake. Lord knows that's what Nana did for him when he needed it most. When he heard the crying start up, he wasn't worried. He knew he just needed to get it out. But for some reason, the longer it went on, the more unsettled he got. His gut was telling him it was something more than just grief at whatever the kid went through. At first, he was still ready to let him work it out of his system, but then he remembered how he felt whenever Yamada and Shirakumo treated him with kindness he didn't ask for. He was logical, but he was human. He found himself walking across the hall the second the thought entered his head, much to his own dismay. Calming him down was easy enough. He's been with Yamada during one of his meltdowns, so Shirakumo taught him the basics after their mutual self-destructive panic ricocheted for far longer than what was needed. He thought he wasn't helping at first, and had actually been getting ready to call Yamada himself and ask what he should do, but he slowly became more responsive to his coaching. After a while, when he finally glanced up and looked at him, Aizawa found himself strangely relieved. He was a logical man, which is why when he saw the same kid lost in the hallways, overwhelmed and overstimulated, he made sure that Shirakumo and Yamada could help by pointing them in the right direction. It was why he comforted him in the hallway and told him what to expect. It was why he watched him during classes while he was taking his test, to make sure he was okay. It didn't explain the strange blush he got every time he looked at him, but he was willing to write it off. He was willing to write off the weird fluttery feeling in his chest whenever he had pinned him in sparring too, no matter what Shirakumo teased him about. Everything he does comes back to logicality in the end. When he sees the dozens of packages for Yagi and suggests they help him unpack. When he smacks Yamada on the head for asking invasive questions and making him sad. When he listens to him talk without interruption, snorting at the stories and letting him get it off his chest. When they put together more furniture than he's ever seen in one place. When he beats Yamada up for fucking up the same assembly for the 4th time. When he heard screaming in the middle of the night, he almost jumped out of his skin. He had been in a state of half-sleep, the closest to actual rest he's been in a while, when muffled shouts reached his room. He was almost worried he was back in the foster home for a minute before he remembered his new neighbor. A new kind of fear settled into his chest as he shot over to Yaga's room, fully prepared for a fatal injury or a burglar. When he saw that he was still asleep, presumably having a nightmare, he felt the terror ease up enough to think waking him up was the only thing to really do here. "Yagi," he whispered, moving over to his bedside carefully. Yagi let out a half whimper, his arms coming up from his sides to cover his head. He felt a strange almost pang in his heart. "Yagi," he whispered a little louder, grabbing his arm and shaking him a bit. Yaga's quiet mumbles were a little more audible, but the only word he could catch was Deku. He narrowed his eyes, shaking his head a bit, before shaking his arm harder, more firmly. "Naga Izuku," he yelled, voice deafeningly loud in the quiet room. Nana was far enough away to not hear any quieter noises, but that didn't mean he wanted to be yelling in the middle of the night. He was pretty sure Nedzu would actually kill him if he did. The boy shot awake, letting out a garbled shout as he crowded away from Aizawa frantically. "And no, please don't, not again, I can't," he wailed, his voice hitched and broken. He silently crept up the side of his bed and sat at the foot, his hands held in front of him as a peace offering. "Yagi, Izuku, I'm not going to hurt you. It's Aizawa. You're at the dorms on UA campus. This is your room. We just finished setting everything up today with Shirakumo and Yamada. You're safe." If this didn't work, he didn't know what he would do. Aizawa. He felt relief flood him, and he mentally thanked every god he could think of. Emotions were not his strong suit. Kami forbid he have a panic attack after this. "Yeah, it's me. It's just me," he cried out, a small and pitiful noise that made his heart clench strangely. "Why you?" he whimpered, his voice rough and tiny. "Hey, it's okay, don't stress about it. We all get nightmares. I don't live on campus because my home life was sunshines and rainbows." He strained, desperately trying to distract him with his own special brand of humor. He choked out a small giggle, and Aizawa found himself feeling a touch lighter at the noise. "Sorry, didn't mean to wake you," he whispered. "You're all right. I'm a light sleeper when I sleep at all, that is. The amount of times I've been woken up by Nana breaking one thing or another is ridiculous and completely illogical. Tell him it's not his fault, don't tell him you can't sleep anyways. Tell him Nana does the same shit even though it only happened once and it was because she almost burned the whole damn dorm down. Don't make him feel like a burden." Strangely enough, his inner monologue sounded an awful lot like Oboro. Still, Yagi muttered, I'm not important enough to be disturbing you. Aizawa hesitated. He was clearly half asleep and delirious, which is the only reason he would be talking like that. He should just tuck him in and go back to his dorm. But, what do you mean? He asked, his voice barely a whisper as he tried not to shake him out of his half-asleep state. I'm just some Deku. Don't need to be bothering your sleep or anything. He paused, a cold feeling sinking in his gut. There's that word again, Deku. He had muttered something along those lines when he was still having the nightmare, but he hadn't thought anything of it. Doesn't that mean useless? He asked, a touch of nerves lining his voice. This was invasive in just about every meaning of the word. But he had to know. Yagi yawned, already on his way back to sleep. Yeah, useless. She tried to reclaim it for me. Told me it could mean I can do it, but they always knew. I was just a waste of space. He paused, listening as Izuku's breathing evened out. He silently tucked the comforter up. Before watching him for a moment, he had tear tracks down his face, and his hair was still in the braid Hisashi had put it in, albeit messier. This boy was something like he had never seen before, but all he could do is be there for him and hope he opens up eventually. For now, it's time to go back to bed and hope Yagi's sleep is more restful. He'll text Yamada and Aburo in the morning. It's only logical after all. Izuku wakes up feeling surprisingly well rested, and gets a solid 15 seconds of peace before he remembers his late night ordeal. Suddenly shooting up and out of bed in a flurry of panic, he stood stock still in his room as he went through the 12 stages of grief of Aizawa bearing witness to his nightmare. This hadn't even been one of the worst ones he'd had, and even still he went and called himself a worthless Deku to Aizawa's face. He has started to accept his place in the past, but at this moment he wished harder than he had since he first woke up. Hear that he would wake up in his old dorm and discover this was just a bad dream. How humiliating can life get at this point? It's like his goal was to make himself as embarrassing and weak-looking as possible in front of these incredible pro-heroes in the making. His late alarm blared, jarring him enough to collapse back on the foot of his bed with a loud groan. Now he has to face the day, and more importantly Aizawa, and pretend he isn't completely mortified by his own existence. Giving himself a minute to berate himself and wish he could be absorbed into his bed, he finally rose fully to get ready for the day. After a quick shower and changing into his uniform, he reluctantly left the solitude of his dorm to go downstairs to eat his breakfast. Better to face the problem head-on than to avoid him, right? Right. Izuku could honestly say he had no idea what to expect from the common room kitchen. In his own time, there had been a constant state of chaos and various levels of screaming almost every morning before classes, between Bakugo making breakfast for his Baka squad, Ada mother henning any student who didn't have a breakfast he deemed appropriate with enough calories and nutrients, and 19 different students trying to feed themselves at the same time. It was a catastrophe. Izuku found it overwhelming at first, having come from a small apartment with nobody but his mother, but had quickly grown fond of his chaotic morning routine. Shower, brush your teeth, put your uniform on, sit at the kitchen table and listen as 18 different students clamber over each other to try and feed themselves before classes. It was easily one of his favorite parts of the day, watching Bakugo bark at different classmates who got too close to his bubble and teenagers who had little to no idea how to cook try to make themselves edible meals up to Mother Ida's standards. Izuku wasn't in his time though. He was 15 years in the past. And there were only 4 other people in the dorms with him, 2 of which he was positive wouldn't be seen dead in the common rooms, and another one whom he doubted ate the recommended 3 meals a day. So when he came downstairs to see Aizawa slumped over the table, obviously half asleep, and Nana standing over the stove singing a song he didn't recognize, he was no more surprised than had it been empty and untouched. When he entered the kitchen, Aizawa didn't as much as twitch in acknowledgement. Izuku would almost think he was dead if there wasn't the shallow rise and fall of his back to prove him otherwise. Nana paused her song, something American perhaps, and half turned to face him with a bright smile on her face. "Yagi, it's good to see you," she cheered, her attention split between the omelet on the stovetop and Izuku's slow slink over to the table. "I wasn't sure if you would be coming down to join us for breakfast or not. You didn't yesterday." Izuku's stomach grumbled in reminder of his skipped meals the previous day. With everything going on, he hadn't found the time to eat as much as he normally did, not to mention that he didn't go grocery shopping until after dinner. Izuku blushed and laughed quietly, sitting at the table with his preferred brand of breakfast bar tucked safely in his jacket pocket. "Yeah, I didn't have the time yesterday." He carefully avoided looking at Aizawa down the table and instead focused solely on unwrapping the bar, his blush steadily creeping down his neck. Nana took her omelet off the stove, placing it on the table in a spot near them both, before turning to look fully at Izuku and deflating dramatically. "Oh, not you too," she groaned, smacking her hand to her forehead in distaste. "You and Aizawa both, I swear. The only thing that kid eats is his stinking juice pouches, and you're over there eating a protein bar. Are all Hero Course students like this?" Izuku laughed quietly as Aizawa grumbled irritably, his head not leaving its spot on the table. "They're nutrient pouches. They have everything I need to keep myself sustained. I don't see the purpose of taking the time to eat real food as you put it when it will just slow me down. I'll eat lunch, that's plenty. Nana huffed in distaste. Yeah, your skeletal figure speaks wonders on how well that's working for you. You need real food to grow, young man. You're only a year older than me. Grandma, he snarled back, finally lifting his head off the table as if a 20-pound weight was attached to his neck. He looked more exhausted than usual, and Izuku felt a pang of guilt as he realized it was probably because of him. Aizawa glanced over at him with a squinted glare, perfectly conveying the meaning of knock it off, something Izuku knew well from his time in his homeroom. Another wave of emotions hit him. These ones a terrible mixture of grief for the Aizawa sensei he knew and guilt for ruining his friend's sleep. This would not be a good day. Breakfast went much of the same capacity. Nana was trying her best to keep conversation flowing, and Izuku was thankful for it, honestly, but between his mind-numbing mixture of leftover mourning, guilt, and embarrassment, he wasn't much for small talk. Aizawa varied between half asleep and giving scolding glances towards Izuku when he felt like he was being too self-deprecating with his silent pity party. He didn't know how Aizawa knew whenever his thoughts started to border on self-loathing, but he always did. When it was time to leave for classes, Izuku tried to skitter past Aizawa while Nana had him trapped in another lecture, but he caught up with him quickly and matched his stride with ease on their way to the main building. You said something about Deku last night, Aizawa said. He didn't waste time with small talk, greetings, or padding his words to make them less harsh. Instead, he had what sounded like a beta version of his no-nonsense tone he used for serious conversations as a teacher. It still made Izuku flinch in place, something he was sure didn't go unnoticed. Yeah, he muttered, tracing the grout lines on the pavement with his eyes. There was a group of first-years making a ruckus by the main entrance a while ahead of them. It was a nickname, I guess. One of my old classmates gave it to me. His voice was uncomfortably tight, and his sentences were cracked and forced, but he was desperate to get the words out anyways. If he couldn't even do this much, who was he to call himself a hero? Aizawa hummed quietly beside him. You said that she tried to reclaim it for you, but they all knew you were a waste of space. Izuku flinched again, this time more heavy than the last. The last remnants of his voice died in his throat and his breath hitched. Waste of space. Aizawa stopped walking towards the building, instead quietly directing them both to a spot behind one of the walls close to the main building. Izuku felt a low whine rumble in his throat, near silent and grating on his vocal cords, and Aizawa shushed him quietly in response. I just want to help you, Aizawa soothed carefully. His voice was low and smooth, and so remnant of his future self it made another whimper catch in Izuku's throat. Aizawa hesitated, before pushing on with a hint of uncertainty peeking through his voice. I know you said you're in witness protection, and you will tell us whenever the time is right, but something about you doesn't line up. I know you're not lying to us for fun or anything, but we can't help you unless we know what we're helping with. We're heroes too. Let us help you carry whatever it is you have. Izuku nodded, raising his hands to respond. He pointedly looked at the wall behind Aizawa, not ready to look at him directly while he explained. He paused, suddenly unsure how far to go. Before he could form his words, a crash sounded from around the corner. Aizawa jumped slightly, whipping his head towards the sudden noise, and Izuku fell down into a defensive stance immediately, his quirk sparking against his skin in a knee-jerk panic reaction. Quiet cursing, almost too quiet to hear, reached them just before a head poked around the bend. Principal Tsukishima, Aizawa asked, uncertainty filtering in his tone. What are you doing back here? Well, I could ask the same of you, Tsukishima said after a moment, his hands brushing down the front of his robes. His spiraled eyes seemed to bore straight into Izuku, and for a moment he felt uncomfortably guilty about almost talking to Aizawa about it, even with permission previously given. Class starts in 10 minutes. I received a notification from a camera that there were students hanging behind Gym Beta. I came to make sure there wasn't any fishy activity going on, of course. Aizawa nodded, and after a second Izuku nodded as well. We'll head to class, sir, Aizawa said, gently grabbing the edge of Izuku's sleeve to pull him towards the building. They walked a bit faster than they had before. Izuku felt Tsukishima's gaze the whole way to Class 2A. When they got to class, Aizawa gave him a look that very clearly said they were talking later, just as Yamada and Shirakumo came shooting over to their seats. Yamada had a look of utter ecstasy in his eyes, his hands waving frantically up and down, and Shirakumo looked ready to melt into the floor with his face as red as a fire truck engine. Aizawa. Agi, Yamada squealed, jumping in place a bit. He seemed to be fighting his quirk with the way his voice would jump between reasonably loud and ear-piercing. Aizawa groaned a bit and dropped his head on his desk. determined not to make eye contact and inadvertently encourage his excitement. Izuku, on the other hand, willingly let himself be swept up in Yamada's joy and smiled broadly at his excitable friend. What happened?" Izuku asked, his voice still slightly hoarse as he began to relax around his friends. Yamada didn't as much as falter at his lack of clarity. Instead, he leaned forward dramatically to rest his upper body on Izuku's desk, his face so close to him he could feel his breath on his nose. "Nimuri asked Aburo out," he yelled. From this close, Izuku could see the rings around his pupil, something he had never noticed before. Shirakumo let out a strangled whine, snapping him back to the present, and he whipped his head towards his other friend. Shirakumo was half dissolved on the ground, his red cheeks and ears steadily creeping down his neck. He seemed to be at a loss for words. "Really?" Izuku said, bouncing slightly. Shirakumo didn't say a word, choosing to collapse his head forward and bury it in his knees. Aizawa snorted from the seat ahead of him. Before anyone could say anything further, the bell rang, leaving Yamada to fly into his seat like someone had burned him, and Shirakumo to immediately panic and attempt to scramble to his feet before a small ahem caught their attention at the front of the room. Nezu sat at his desk in his famous oversized chair, a feral smile on his face. "Shirakumo, I do request that you start class in your seat next time, rather than next to it." Shirakumo shot to his feet and rushed over to his seat, the red in his face draining and leaving him pale white. Izuku was starting to worry about his blood flow. It can't be good having that much blood pooled in your cheeks for so long and then having it rush out like that in such a short period of time. "Well, now we can begin. I don't have any announcements today, so it'll be a study hall. Yagi, with me. I finished grading your test." The smile on Nezu's face brought a shiver down Izuku's spine, and he nodded shakily as he rose to his feet. Aizawa gave him a look that perfectly conveyed "I'm sorry for your loss," and Yamada winced sympathetically. Shirakumo didn't react, as he was still recovering from the flurry of emotions he'd been put through this morning. Izuku followed Nezu to his private office in a silent panic. He knows he was told it was all right if he didn't get everything right, but the perfectionist in him was floundering at the thought of not getting a good score. Nezu sat at his chair behind his desk, and Izuku nervously sat in front of it, wringing his hands underneath the table. Nezu smiled again, and Izuku didn't even know where to start to decode what that meant. "Well, let's start with your worst and work our way up, shall we?" he hummed, sorting through papers. "Your literature results were as we both expected, and you will be given a list of books to complete and an essay of your choosing for each one to finish alongside your normal workload. For math, you are about where you need to be for the classes you'll be taking, so you won't need any supplemental work. But if you find yourself struggling, do ask for help. Yes. History was above average for your age, and you will do well in the second-year classes, and in science you did very similarly. For English and quirk theory, you passed with flying colors. Should you choose, you will be able to test out of the classes your peers will be taking. If you do decide to do that, however, I would like to request you consider allowing me to take you on as a personal student during the periods you will be missing. I do believe that we would make an extraordinary team and that you would be able to learn much from what I have to offer." Izuku took a long second to decipher what he was told, and felt his brain slowly reboot. He passed. He didn't expect to do well on the literature portion, to be frank, and he expected to do a bit worse than he did in math, but even still, he passed the test. And with flying colors on his favorite subjects, he could test out and take personal lessons with the Nezu, future principal of UA and renowned genius, instead of relearning subjects he was well acquainted with. He would be an absolute fool not to take up the offer. Nezu's expression took on a more manic gleam, and he leaned forward in his chair. "I take that as a yes, then," he said, his voice sparkling with excitement. Izuku looked up from where he had been staring at his hands and realized he must have been muttering. It didn't take them longer than 10 minutes to come up with a game plan for lessons and get the ball rolling. After emailing the quirk theory and English teacher and getting permissions where needed, it was all but set in stone. Quirk theory and English were back-to-back classes for second years and took place directly before lunch, so it was decided he would have an extended lesson with Nezu every day at that time and then go to lunch and continue classes as normal. Nezu was thrilled at the concept, and since he didn't teach any classes during those periods, it was an uninterrupted, extended period of time for him to teach what he wanted to teach but couldn't with the base curriculum. Not to mention that they lived in the same building. Nezu had the glee of the cat who finally caught the canary. When Izuku made his way back to class, alone this time as Nezu joyfully came up with his first lesson plan for a few hours from now, he felt lighter than he had all day. Things weren't going to be all bad, with Nezu teaching him and friends unconditionally on his side when they had barely met. Things are almost seeming better than they had been when he was still in his own time. He came to a sudden screeching halt at that thought. Better than they had been in his time. If he was given the option to return to his time right now, would he take it? He missed his friends something fierce, and couldn't think about his mother without a piece of his heart breaking off. But would he trade everything he's gained for that old life? He didn't know anymore. When he entered the classroom and made his way over to his seat, he wasn't surprised to see that Aizawa was still napping with Yamada and Shirakumo crowded around him. As he made his way over to them, Yamada looked up and smiled a million-watt grin, immediately stopping what he had been saying. "Yagi, how did it go? You're still alive." Izuku laughed and sat down at his seat willingly. "It went so well," he said, bouncing up and down slightly as the excitement set in. "I can test out of English and quirk theory, so Nedzu is taking me on as a personal student for those 2 periods instead. I have to read a list of books for literature. But are you guys okay?" Aizawa, who had been listening in silence, suddenly paled several shades and dropped his head back on his desk, completely unresponsive. Shirakumo, who looked like he had recovered from that morning, dropped back to his knees next to Izuku's seat with his hands in his head, and Yamada stood stock still with a haunted expression on his face. "Personal student," Yamada whispered, his eyes wide. "Why yeah, he said we would make a good team and he had a lot to teach me what's wrong." The more he spoke, the more distraught they seemed to get. Yamada collapsed in his seat behind him, his head dropping to his hands, and Aizawa let out a muffled groan from his desk. Shirakumo lifted his head enough to look Izuku in the eyes, horror written across his face. "When you take over the world someday, remember that we were friends, yeah," he mumbled numbly, his hands gripping the edge of Izuku's desk as if he was groveling. Izuku tittered nervously, inching away from him as far as he could go in his seat slowly. Why would I take over the world?" he asked, looking between the people closest to him for help. The other 8 students in the room were pointedly ignoring their conversation, most of them pale and all of them staring in the opposite direction of their group, and Yamada and Aizawa were both still too distraught to help him any. "He's going to corrupt you. Any innocence you have left is going to be destroyed before you take over the commission. At least give us a warning so we can leave the country for a few days," Shirakumo warned, dropping his head on Izuku's desk. Izuku let out another high-pitched, nervous laugh, but thankfully didn't get any time to respond as the bell rang for the next class. Shirakumo stood and slunk to his desk, the color not yet returning to his face, and Aizawa lifted his head enough to stare to the front of the room with dead eyes. He wasn't sure what all of that was about, but surely everything would be fine. Today we will be learning how to hack into government agencies. Izuku takes back everything he thought about what he was getting into. As Nedzu grinned, less so a smile and more so a baring of teeth from across the desk with a computer set up neatly in front of him and paws clasped together, he thought that maybe the rest of them were right to be afraid. Despite how scary it sounded, and how intimidating Nedzu made it feel, hacking wasn't as hard as what people made it out to be. After the extended period together, Izuku had a basic grasp of it and could successfully get past a weak firewall. He wasn't quite at the point of hacking into any government agencies like Nedzu was so keen for him to do, but with how fast he was picking up the basics, he almost believed he might be able to do it someday. Not that he would do anything with this skill set, of course, but he couldn't lie and say it wasn't something he was pleased to have under his belt. Izuku left his office with a large grin on his face and the homework assignment to hack into any UA teacher's computer or email as he saw fit. After an extensive amount of time promising him that he wouldn't get into any trouble and that Nedzu would vouch for him if he was caught, though the goal was to go undetected. He was lucky enough to run into Kayama on his way to the lunchroom. He immediately bounced over to her, any hesitations about her erased after yesterday's lunch, and hummed to himself as he stuck by her side to ease through the crowds. "Why aren't you with the other 3 today?" she asked as they finally made their way to the line. Izuku laughed quietly and prayed that she didn't have the same reaction as the rest of them before muttering that he had private lessons with Nedzu instead of quirk theory and English classes. She did pale several shades, but before she could stutter out any questions, the glimpse of a person sprinting towards her, a blur of motion with their arms stretched out wide towards Kayama's back, caught Izuku's eye. Izuku sputtered in shock and backed up a step. But before he could say anything, they were on top of her, arms wrapped around her head and legs hitched around her waist. For her credit, she barely let out a yelp of surprise before she was shifting her balance to hold the weight of the new student, grabbing their legs as she stumbled forward a bit. From the look on her face that he could see between the person's arms, she wasn't as much scared as she was exasperated. Izuku gaped, watching as she shook the person off of her with an irritated hiss. The new person was laughing, and he shifted his attention to them just as they walked out from behind Kayama, a large grin on their face. "Ada," he whispered, voice cracking a bit. He felt some of the color draining from his face, and his heart jumped to his throat. He turned to look fully at Izuku, and he relaxed a small bit when he saw their full profile. This wasn't his Ada. "That must mean, do I know you?" he asked, not unkindly as he smiled a bit. Izuku blushed and shook his head, averting his eyes to his shoes. No, we haven't met. I just recognized you from some stuff I've heard. You come from a hero family, right?" he stuttered, nervously clasping his hands together. Ada smiled and nodded along with him. Yeah, I do. It's not common that I get recognized from that stuff." He laughed, face scrunched up. He was very different from his brother and seemed much more laid back and carefree. He didn't think it was possible to miss the redwood-sized stick up his friend's ass, but he almost found himself doing just that as the older Ada turned to face Kayama with a big grin on his face. Apparently, the older Ada was a part of the rooftop gang as they called themselves, but he only sat with them every other day as he alternated between them and his class's table. He was the unknown number in the group chat that hadn't texted yet. He said he wasn't as rambunctious as Yamada and Shirakumo were and found out quickly that any of his texts were quickly buried underneath their spam-like messages, leading to him not messaging unless the chat was quiet or it was important. They made it through the line relatively quickly, and Izuku found himself drifting off in thoughts as he watched the two interact. He frequently found himself trapped in between, missing his old home with everything he had and an unbalanced sense of peace, almost joy with where he was at the moment these days. He didn't think himself weak or easy to destabilize with everything he's been through. Everything life has thrown at him has been overcome in one way or another, has been something he was able to push aside. Everything he's ever worked for was to be a hero, until it wasn't. Until he realized how much his mother cared, how kind and loving his friends were. The last year of his life has been something that has changed his outlook on everything. And just as he found himself completely and perfectly settled in where he was, it was taken away from him. He was adaptable, but he had been secure. Now that that's gone, he doesn't know what he's supposed to be. He finds himself trapped in between a rock and a hard spot, missing his old life and everything it gave him, and wanting to find that peace, that security in his new life. And that's what it was, wasn't it? His new life. He'd been here long enough he doubted there would be a miraculous change of events that could send him back. Even if it had only been about 2 days, the longest recorded time travel was an hour. And even if he was sent back, he would still find himself in this spot of insecurity, missing the life that he had for such a short period of time. It's hard to believe it had only been a few days since he was sent here. He's left everything he'd ever loved behind, and didn't even grieve past a full 24 hours. Hey, Yonki, is he broken for that? He misses them something fierce, but he didn't feel the soul-crushing weight he felt the first night here. Maybe it was the bonds he was making. Maybe it was that adaptability thing he was talking about. Maybe it's because he knew, no matter how much he loved his friends and his mom, there was always something missing, something unsettled and out of place in his life. He'd never felt like he truly belonged. It had been easy to chalk up to being quirkless in his younger years, and once he received his quirk, it was easy to say it was because he was a quirkless soul shoved into a quirked body. But now that he was here, he almost felt like he fit. Yags. He blinked slowly. Oh right, that was his name, wasn't it? He wasn't a Midoriya anymore. Yagi Izuku, pro hero in training Quantum. Deku has died and been left in a time he couldn't return to. That's right, come on. Can you look at me? He hummed slowly, blinked a few extra times for good measure. He could see Yamada sat across from him, so close their knees were touching. He had his hands on either side of his face, his odd eyes boring into Izuku. He didn't notice before that only one of his eyes had the rings around the pupil. The other one was a similar shade of green, but distinctly different in its pattern and just slightly darker. How strange. It's because it's a contact. He deadpanned. He heard someone snort a half-laugh behind him. Do you know where you are? He shifted his face out of Yamada's hands to look around a bit. Surprisingly enough, he was on the roof. Kayama, Ida, and Shirakumo sat over to the side while they ate their lunch, and Aizawa sat on his other side, watching them closely. He nodded, and felt a bit of the fluff in his brain clear out. He hummed to himself, the buzzing in his brain settling that last piece that had drifted off into place. He looked back at Yamada, who looked a bit more relaxed than he did before. Sorry, he mumbled, looking just above Yamada's shoulder. Guess I got a bit distracted. Yamada huffed a bit and shook his head. You were mumbling up a storm. Apparently sometime after the lunch line you got a bit unresponsive. Has that happened before? Izuku tilted his head and thought. He could name a few times in his life when that feeling came over him and he found himself floating off, but he had either been alone or nobody noticed. He shrugged a bit. I mean, a little bit. It's not really a problem. Sometimes I just get stuck in my head. He spared a glance over at Ida, and Yamada followed his gaze before flickering his eyes back and forth between Izuku and Ida, a bewildered expression on his face. Izuku blushed a bit and ducked his head, and Aizawa let out a thoughtful noise. Does this have to do with what you were going to tell me this morning? He asked, voice carefully guarded. He saw the two on the other side of the roof glance over, sneakily staring between him and Ida, who looked very confused. Sort of, he mumbled. He looked over at Ida again and spotted his kicked puppy expression, and immediately backpedaled, flailing his hands with a bright red face. It's not you. You just remind me of someone I used to know. You didn't do anything. I just got stuck in my head thinking about that stuff. He finished lamely, looking back down at his shoes. Yaga's shoes, not Midoriya's. Yamada hadn't moved yet and was still sitting directly in front of him. their knees bumping together every time one of them shifted. It was oddly grounding and sort of comforting in a sense. "Oh, I understand," he said, voice shockingly kind. His voice was just like his younger brother's would be, but the tempo in which he talked was so different it helped fish any remaining feelings back to the present easily. "I'm not offended or hurt or anything." He was sure if he looked over, he would see a kind smile and squinted eyes, but he almost couldn't bear to see it at the moment, so he stuck with offering his niece a small smile. Close enough. Thankfully, the rest of them knew not to bring anything up and easily directed the conversation into easier topics. Izuku was almost disappointed when Yamada shifted farther back, but he soon found his face flaming a bright red when he simply grabbed his lunch tray and sat back down next to him, their knees touching just enough for it to be grounding. Aizawa shifted so that he was seated back in the circle, and while he was farther away from Izuku than Yamada was, he was still notably closer than he had been the day before. The rest of lunch passed quickly and Izuku was easily absorbed into the conversation. Kayama spent her time making as much contact with Shirakumo as possible and all but purring in his ear, who on his end was a shade of red so bright it clashed with his hair and made him look like an overripe tomato. Yamada and Shirakumo asked him how his lessons with Nedzu went, and were distraught when they heard his homework. Ada, for his part, didn't seem as heavily affected by the information as the others had been, but still looked a bit unsettled at the concept. It was comfortable. They left the roof earlier than they had the day before. He had the sneaking suspicion it was thanks to Ed, but would wait to confirm his theory until the following day when he wouldn't be eating with them. When they arrived at the classroom, the other students were slowly trickling in, and Nedzu was already seated at his desk with the same feral grin he had had all day, pointedly ignoring whatever that was. They stalled the time before the bell rang to tease Shirakumo over Kayama and their date. Izuku didn't miss the exasperated looks he sent the other two, but had no idea what they were over, so he didn't dwell for too long. The second the bell rang, the whole class was silent and seated, waiting for Nedzu to tell them what they were doing. Good. Everybody is on time. A pointed look to the four of them. Today is the USJ, as I'm sure you're all aware, so I would like everybody to go to the locker rooms to change into their costumes. Yagi, yours isn't quite ready yet, but it seems Hatsum is taking it upon herself to finish the entire thing, so it won't be too much longer. Izuku felt the smile drop off his face almost instantaneously, and grabbed the edge of his desk with an iron grip at the announcement. The USJ. His class hadn't made it a habit to return to the USJ after the incident that occurred their first week. Any and all rescue training was done on campus with help from Cementos and 13. And while it wasn't quite the same thing, it was as close as many of them were comfortable getting for the time being. They had been informed that they would put off USJ trips until the end of their first year to save them from any unnecessary panic and to give the school time to crack down on security and construction for the building. He hadn't been back there since. He reached his hand out and snatched the end of Aizawa's jacket before he could fully stand. He turned around with a questioning look on his face, but immediately looked a bit more serious when he saw the expression on Izuku's face. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked, shifting so he was directly next to Izuku's desk. The hand that wasn't grabbing Aizawa's coat was still latched painfully on the desk. His head bowed down as his shoulders shook faintly. Yamada came over and stood on his other side, and he was almost hyper-aware of Shirakumo talking to Nedzu before leaving the class after the rest of his class, glancing back with a worried expression. Yamada reached down and put his hand on top of the hand grabbing the desk, gently rubbing the knuckles in an attempt to loosen his hand. "Yagi, what's up?" Yamada asked, voiced the same level tone he had used on the roof. How embarrassing. He couldn't even make it a full period without humiliating himself in front of his friends. "Stop it, we want to help you," Aizawa chided, moving his hands down to hold Izuku's where Izuku's clung to his jacket. This was going to be harder to explain. How could he tell them that the last time he was in the USJ he was attacked by a group of villains and his teacher, Aizawa himself, was almost killed when they didn't know he's even heard of the USJ before? He shook his head and willingly clung to their hands. Taking a deep breath, he looked up and risked a glance at Nedzu's desk. The nut rat sat in his seat, watching them with something almost akin to regret. When Izuku made eye contact with him, Nedzu mimed taking a deep breath. As he followed along shakily, Nedzu hopped down and made his way over to them. "I apologize, Yagi. I wasn't aware that the USJ would be a triggering location for you," Nedzu chirped quietly. He took another shaky breath and nodded slowly. It's okay. I should be able to handle hearing the word without panicking. I'll get over it," he muttered. He released his hold on his friend's hands, red at the ears, and failed to miss the slightly disappointed look Yamada had or the matching pink ears that hid under Aizawa's hair. Even still, nobody knows the extent of what you've been through other than you, Yagi-kun. Don't apologize for having gone through things your classmates can't imagine," Nedzu murmured. "Are you okay to participate today?" Izuku didn't take a second's pause before he answered. "Yes, I need this training, arguably even more so than my classmates. Plus ultra, right." He didn't miss Nedzu's smile at the school's familiar say. "We will make it a better experience than what you've had before. Now, hurry up and go change, you're all late." The three of them made their way to the locker room in relative silence. He didn't ignore the fact that the other two were trying to put together the puzzle pieces they had been given, but he doubted they would be able to understand without Izuku giving them the final answer. After all, he wouldn't assume his strange classmate was from the future either. For now, all they needed to worry about was the USJ. They would take it from there. The bus ride to the USJ was filled with Izuku's jittering despite how hard he tried to conceal them. Every time he looked over at Aizawa, he couldn't help the tremors and hitched breath. Aizawa, ever observant, must have noticed a pattern to his fears, but also must have decided that it wasn't worth confronting him over at that moment. To absolutely no one's surprise, the USJ wasn't filled with villains when they arrived. Izuku couldn't help the side glances and the uncomfortable tension he had in his shoulders when he glanced to the center every few seconds. But it was empty. It was designed much the same as he recognized from his first visit. The only visible difference being instead of 13 guiding them along, it was a hero who Izuku faintly recognized from older discords he joined. He was killed in action sometime after Izuku's birth. If he remembered correctly, needless to say, it was a bit strange. The training went surprisingly well. Aside from the panic attack he had when faced with the flood zone, Izuku was proud of himself for pushing forward. 13's improvised rescue training had been relatively effective, and he was able to keep up with instruction and his classmates with few errors. He didn't fail to notice the concerned glances his friends threw at him, or the fact Nedzu kept him as far away from the flood zone as possible after the first encounter with it, but he was almost grateful for it. When they finally left the USJ, Izuku couldn't help the full-bodied relief that swarmed him as he sat down on the bus and found the sudden loss of adrenaline leaving him a puddle on his seat. He melted against the back of the seat and found himself embarrassingly close to crying from relief it was over. Aizawa and Yamada sat on either side of him, as they had been doing, and Shirakumo sat across from them. He was faintly aware of his other classmates coming in and pointedly ignoring their group out of respect for their privacy, but he couldn't find it in him to acknowledge any of them. Aizawa nudged his shoulder against Izuku, and he took the invitation as what it was without a second of hesitation, slumping against him with a short whine. Shirakumo huffed faintly, but nobody said a word. It was more comfortable that way. Holding Yamada's hand, half asleep against Aizawa's shoulder and bumping knees with Shirakumo, everything felt almost right. When Izuku got back to the dorms that night, he found himself speed-running all of his regular homework in excitement for his task from Nedzu. It wasn't often that he got through the amount of work he did in such a short amount of time, but by 5 he was caught up in the work from the day as well as a bit of his extra from literature. His friends were out on campus doing extra training, and while they had invited him along, he denied it under the prospect of getting caught up with his academic work. He kindly refrained from telling them it was for his special assignment, as he wasn't sure if they could handle the information. Settling down in his chair and setting up his computer, the only question left was who he should spy on. Nedzu was out of the question if he wanted to have a chance of passing, as he was sure that he had enough firewalls around his email and computer to protect the nationwide secrets he no doubt had buried in his belongings, not to mention he wasn't sure he wanted to know what he had on his computer. He didn't know any of the other teachers very well, save the few he had met in his time. He had only just been introduced to the other teachers, most of which he hadn't heard of. Spare the rescue teacher. It would be suspicious if he was caught hacking the teachers he hadn't spent much time with in this period. No matter Nedzu backing him, and he wasn't really interested in the rescue teacher's information. It felt invasive to dig through his information when Izuku knew full well he would die within the next year or two. That left Tsukishima, the principal of the top hero school in the country. For a split second, he almost reconsidered Nedzu, but the mental image of his manic grin with dozens of firewalls and false leads left him resigned to the concept of digging through the principal's email and computer. Although, he probably has just as many protective layers as Nedzu given his position. 20 minutes later, he proved himself wrong, and his laptop was mirrored to the principal's screen. After a minute of internal panic and questioning why it was so easy, what does he do now? He saw movement on the screen. He was typing, careful not to touch anything and alert him of his presence. Izuku quieted down the inner voice that was screaming about disrespect and privacy to read what he was saying. After all, Nedzu said he would vouch for him. It was an email to a private recipient in a browser that Izuku wasn't familiar with, but he could guess it was one that didn't save history or data. Before he could stop himself, he was reading the contents of the message, his earlier fears of getting in trouble disregarded by his curiosity. I do not have updates on the dismantlement of the school board and the UA infiltration plan. However, I have news that I feel you will find much more appealing. A student arrived at the front gates of the school the other day claiming to be an accidental time traveler. After a bit of interrogating and proof, I can confirm he is in fact from 15 years in the future. The most interesting part is the information I was handed by recovery girl after the boy passed out. However, this young man is the 9th holder of OFA. I knew little of its existence before now, but after some carefully worded questions, I can confirm with certainty that this is the same quirk you desire. I urge you to abandon the plan for the school takeover and instead focus on this gift handed to us on a silver platter. With a bit of coercion and misplaced trust, the power that is rightfully yours could be back in your hands within a year. The boy will be yours, and your goal will be complete. Your faithful servant Tsukishima Mun. Izuku stared at his screen as the message was sent, his mouth open and his heart racing in his throat. The principal was a traitor. He felt the exact moment that the information hit him, and slammed his laptop shut with a bit too much force. He scrambled backwards, the chair he was in tipping backwards and toppling him to the ground with a loud clatter. How could he have been so stupid? With the pressure of time travel and the disorienting change in pace, he forgot all about the League of Villains. How could he have forgotten that All for One was after his neck? He broadcasted his quirk to the principal with no disregard for how it would affect the timeline. What did this mean for All Might? What did this mean for him? All for One knows he exists, knows his new identity, knows his new appearance. He's not safe at UA. The clamor must have attracted attention, because he heard his front door open and footsteps rush back towards his room. The door opened and revealed not Aizawa as he expected, almost hoped, but Nana. She had a worried look on her face and had clearly rushed to the boys' side of the dorm in a hurry given her disheveled appearance and the soot covering her coveralls and face. "Hey, Yagi, I heard a crash, what's wrong?" she fretted, immediately beelining to kneel in front of where Izuku sprawled on the ground. His chest heaved, and for a minute he was worried he was going to vomit on her shoes before he turned his head and knelt on his hands and knees, facing away from her as he heaved out stomach bile. He heard her fretting in the background, but couldn't find it in him to reassure her. He wasn't safe here. He wasn't safe here. Why couldn't he have one moment of peace? Was this quirk he took on nothing more than a generational curse meant to ruin his life along with anybody else's that has the misfortune of being around him? A hand grazed his back and he let out a strangled half-yell, angry sobs building up in his chest. He was forcefully ripped back into the present when his arm gave out, leaving him uncomfortably close to his own sick. He threw himself back, bumping his tailbone painfully against the ground, and felt as his back smacked against the wall of his room. He could see Nana backed up against the opposite wall, her phone up to her ear and tears built up in the corners of her eyes. But all he could do was let out another strangled scream of frustration. His head lashed backwards, smacking against the wall with a painful bump. The hit resonated through his skull sharply, and he heard Nana trying to stop him, but it was almost as if he wasn't in control of himself as he did it again. He was so angry. Why did this happen to him? Why did he go grocery shopping that day? Why did the villains choose his class to torment? Why did All Might choose him as a successor for the world's worst quirk? He must have done something truly awful in his past life to deserve this load, as he wouldn't wish this bullshit even on his worst enemy. He should never have accepted his offer, should never have gotten off that roof in one piece, should never have chosen to save Kacchan. If he was dead, none of this would have happened. He could have died and not a soul would have missed him, but instead he chose to put himself through this hell. A hand cushioned the back of his head from the wall, and he lashed out with his feet, sobs bubbling from his chest and heaving gasps. He couldn't even keep control of his emotions for 2 hours. Here he goes, throwing a tantrum because he's upset, but he's not just upset, he's scared, and he's so mad. The hand that was cushioning his head was joined by an arm wrapping around his torso, pinning his hands against his body. The touch felt like fire burning his nerves, and he thrashed harshly in a desperate attempt to get them off. He screamed, his throat raw from abuse, but it tapered off into hiccuping wails soon after. As upset as he was, he's never been an angry soul. Grief and fear were much easier emotions to lean into. Slowly, he became aware of words being murmured in his ear. He tapered his cries down quiet enough to be able to decipher them, but even with the newfound quiet he still couldn't quite understand them. Weakly lashing his foot out, the person holding him didn't even flinch. He shook his head rapidly, trying to dislodge the hand, but they just hushed him quietly, not so much as shifting their hands. As he felt the overwhelming slew of emotions slowly shut down, he found the pressure almost comforting. He weakly leaned forward, shifting into the warmth, and felt the person shift so that Izuku was comfortably leaned against their chest, his legs wrapped around their waist and arms still tangled between their bodies. Another sob forced its way through his throat, cracked and broken, and they rocked him back and forth, imitating his stimming near perfectly. He buried his face in their neck and whined quietly to himself to soothe some of his nerves, hums and noises buzzing through his skin and grounding him past the anger and fear that put him here. As his awareness set back in, piece by piece, he found himself looking directly at Aizawa and Shirakumo, sitting against the opposite wall from him and looking at him with thinly veiled concern. "That means, it'll all be okay. You don't need to worry right now. We're here and we aren't leaving. You don't have to worry, everything will be okay." The low hum of words was starting to click in his head, and he finally recognized the comforting buzz around their voice that was uniquely present. Mike. He hummed quietly to himself and pushed his head against Yamada's neck, and the words stopped suddenly. "Back with us," he murmured, voice still buzzing with that something that made his chest rattle with a steady vibration. Izuku nodded weakly, but didn't make to move as Yamada just hummed again, their rocking slowing down to a more comforting lull. The more aware side of his brain was screeching. Incoherent noises mainly, but he wasn't able to do anything about it at the moment. He's had no less than 2 total meltdowns, several small panic attacks, and has been nonverbal more times than he could count in the past 78 hours. He was exhausted. He knew he relied on routine for stability. He would be one of the first people to admit it. In fact, routine was what made him tick, was what kept him going and steady enough to maintain the persona he emitted day to day. Time travel really screwed him over in more ways than one. What was that? Izuku was aware that he's had some dumb ideas in his days, but he's almost sure that this one takes the cake. He's been in the past for about 2 weeks, give or take. There's been some close calls with his secrets, some hearty crying, and some of the closest friendships he's ever had formed, but it could only last so long before that hero complex he had kicked in. Things weren't smooth sailing in Izuku's life, and he was well aware of this fact. So well aware of this fact that as he found himself in a disgustingly dirty vent perched next to the grate of the principal's office at 1:30 in the morning, he wasn't very surprised with himself. After the close call he had, Izuku has made damn sure that he wouldn't get the opportunity to fuck up like that again. This secret was one that he wasn't able to share yet, especially not with the traitor situation and the fact that there was an S-ranked supervillain after his head. He was sure it was suspicious that he froze like a deer in headlights and went completely mute whenever his past is so much as referenced, but he couldn't find another way to avoid telling them everything. And by Kami, it got harder every day. It had been a long 2 weeks, the longest of his life. The days inched past piece by piece, and Izuku found himself strangely restless. In his time, there was always something to keep them occupied. With the dorms full of teenagers and villain attacks every other week, it was more suspicious to find peace and quiet than it was to find mass chaos. In this time, however, it was strangely quiet almost all of the time. There are no lunchroom security alerts, or villain break-ins, or angry Bakugas exploding your bedroom door down at 4 in the morning because he had a dream that you beat him in a fight and needed to make sure you still knew you were below him. It was a normal high school, and normal high school was boring. Footsteps echoed through the grate. Quiet, the movements from someone from the underground, and pacing in a dizzying circle. Tsukishima had been at this for quite some time, and Izuku was getting extraordinarily tired of watching him wear a hole in his carpets. His hair was in the same braid it was always in, but his friendly bunny slippers were replaced with a pair of hard black boots that made muffled taps against his floor. He didn't think it was possible to be disconcerted by his principal's choice of footwear, but he was uncomfortable with the implications that came with it. He wasn't here as Principal Tsukishima. He was here as the mole of Uea villain. A quiet knock on the hardwood door knocked him out of his thoughts. He had been here long enough, his entire torso had gone numb and all the blood had rushed into his ears, but he still found himself tensing marginally at the noise. Tsukishima did the same, and he whipped his head to the door just as it opened. A flicker of emotions crossed his face before it settled on a small smirk. His whole face relaxed into a twisted display of joy. 3 people walked in, and Izuku felt a cold bead of sweat drip down his forehead. The first was the woman whose quirk changed his appearance the first day he was here. He would curse himself out later for not being more nosy about their meeting after he and Nedzu had left. But there wasn't much time to dwell on his oblivion as he became painfully aware of the presence of the second individual. All for one, 15 years younger and without the scars stretching across his face, was standing less than 10 feet away from him. A small child was huddled by his side, his head tucked into the hem of his suit jacket. And after a second, Izuku realized with a pang of something in his chest that this was the much younger version of Shigaraki. A nervous expression on his face as he stared around the room. Tsukishima, all for one, drawled. His voice was smooth and made Izuku's chest tighten marginally. This was the man who wanted his quirk, his body for himself, who was actively trying to kidnap him to do unimaginable things, and who had an unknown array of quirks with completely unknown functions. This was the dumbest thing he's ever done. Sensei, Tsukishima murmured, bowing deeply as the villain approached him. All for one glanced around the office and let out a distasteful hum, before nudging the top of Tsukishima's head as a signal to stand. Your office is eclectic, All for one said. His voice wasn't loud, but even still it echoed uncomfortably in Izuku's head and held a weight to it that almost physically pressed him down. He understood, in a demented way, how he gained the following he has. Tsukishima's expression faltered, before he plastered it back on quickly and responded. It helps with appearances, does it not? How can the principal who lives in his office and dedicates everything to the school possibly be a traitor? All for one hummed. If you're sure you're not going soft on me, Then I see no problems. Of course not, Tsukishima said indignantly. I'm willing to bring you the boy's head on a plate if that's what it takes. There's nothing soft about me, sir. All for One laughed sharply, a fake, grating sound, before nudging Shigaraki out from behind him. Very well. I would like you to meet my successor, Shigaraki Tamura. I brought him along so he could hear some of the information that you have for us. I would very much like for him to have a part in the retrieval of the boy's quirk. Tsukishima nodded, his expression not so much as twitching as he glanced at the boy. Of course not, he said quickly, bowing towards the young boy. Shigaraki immediately turned bright red and tucked his face behind All for One's jacket again. But the man simply gave Shigaraki a none to gentle pushback to get him to stand tall. The woman stepped forward, a small smile on her face. It wasn't like the smile she gave Izuku. Instead, it was more of a grimace. Tsukishima, I want us to get this meeting started. I would prefer to leave this building in one piece. I don't trust your staff not to catch on and raid this office. The sooner the better, in my opinion. All for One said nothing on her demand, and Tsukishima took that as his cue to hurry behind his desk, sitting in his chair and gathering some papers in front of him. All for One chose to remain standing. But as the woman sat down in one of the more regular chairs in front of the desk, Shigaraki took it as his cue to scurry over to a beanbag chair slightly to the side of the desk, an almost invisible smile on his face already cracked and dried from his quirk. All for One glanced at him with distaste, but didn't say anything on it, and Shigaraki's smile widened fractionally as he cozied himself into the seat. Izuku wondered morbidly if this was the first time he'd had the chance to feel such simple pleasures. The meeting wasn't obscenely long, but it was long enough that Izuku had pins and needles in his entire body as he laid in the same position, his breathing shallow as he inhaled dust on every other breath. He was glad he remembered the tape recorder, because towards the end of the discussion his blood had begun to rush through his ears in a loud roar that blocked out the majority of the conversation. After an uncertain amount of time, the woman and Tsukishima finally stood up, silently prompting Shigaraki to do the same and scurry back to All for One's side. Tsukishima strode over to the door to open it for the other three, before he paused at the entryway. He glanced around the room, eyes lingering in certain spots with a pinched expression, before he finally exited the room after them and closed the door behind him. Izuku let out a near-silent breath of relief, and immediately started moving through the vents once more. He was as quiet as he could be, but it was difficult with the metal rocking slightly under his weight, wobbling with a loud, echoing noise. Finally, though, he reached the vent above the one classroom, somewhere he knew he could drop down unseen and escape back to the dorm rooms. His escape was pleasantly easy compared to his getting into the vents, and he was able to move through the remaining halls quietly using the training he remembered from Aizawa-sensei's classes, making it safely into the night breeze. When he finally got back to the dorms, he dropped the tape recorder into his desk drawer before beelining towards his bathroom to take a shower. He would handle everything in the morning. He was almost positive that Nedzu had sensors and cameras in his classroom, but he refused to think on the topic before he was in bed, clean and away from the exposing night air. His dreams consisted of twisted scars and a familiar hand reaching for his face, but it was a part of the job. He was handling it fine. Nedzu pulled him aside the next morning before homeroom, as he had expected. He had expected the questioning stare, the folded paws resting on his desk to make him feel more approachable. What he had not expected was the following conversation. Your friends are worried about you, he hummed, his face twisted with a foreign emotion Izuku couldn't place. Izuku paused, the explanation he came up with the night before dying on his tongue at the unexpected topic. They are worried about me. Very much so, he said, tilting his head a bit. They came to me last night, Aizawa specifically. Though he said the others told him they were worried and volunteered him as their spokesperson, he was clearly concerned. He had gone looking for you last night and couldn't find you in your dorm. He mentioned how you've been strange and jumpy around certain topics related to your past. Imagine my surprise when not an hour after he left, I received a notification that there was a break into my classroom. Izuku felt a blush creep up his neck at the backhanded comment, but didn't say anything yet. Nedzu clearly wasn't finished. I wondered to myself, why would he not come to me? Why would he be in the classroom at near 2:30 in the morning, and come in through the vents nonetheless? It took me a while to trace the beginning of your strange behavior to our second lesson. But I do feel as though I'm on the right track now. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting strangely. So tell me, Izuku-kun, why are you spying on the principal of UA? Izuku winced as he hit the nail directly on the head, and curled his arms protectively around his torso. How embarrassing. He hadn't even gotten the opportunity to defend himself before he was discovered. He knew that Nedzu wasn't the smartest mammal in Japan for no reason, but the fact his friends were so observant and that Aizawa came by the previous night must have just been bad luck. There was no way they cared that deeply about him that they would pick up on small things like that. After a moment's pause as Izuku desperately tried to get some semblance of control in the conversation, Nedzu sighed lightly and leaned back again. I can't help you unless you tell me what's wrong, but tell me this at least, are you in danger? Izuku paused. Was he in danger? Very much so. Would Nezu believe him? The random child who came from 15 years in the future, who nobody knew the past of, over his boss who he's worked under for presumably a long period of time and undoubtedly trusts. Very much not. You won't believe me, he settled on, forcing his eyes up from the floor to look at Nezu. His office felt stiflingly hot, despite the fact he tended to keep it on the cooler side because of his fur. Nezu's expression twitched. I'll find I'm very easily persuaded to believe, especially when it is the truth that is being told. Izuku just shook his head weakly, turning his head down back to the tiles. Nezu sighed again, heavier and more resigned. Very well. I trust you to come to me if things get any worse. There will be consequences if you don't, he warned. Izuku winced again, but didn't say anything further. Nezu stood, heading over to his door to hold it open for Izuku. He stood shakily, but before he could exit the door, a paw on his arm stopped him. Izuku looked down, surprised, and saw Nezu with one of the most serious looks he's ever seen across his face. You're not alone here. You may feel like an outsider, but you have people to trust in these new and confusing times. Don't hesitate to reach out to them. Izuku blinked at him for a moment, surprise tying his tongue in a thick knot. He finally smiled at him, the smile that Deku had been known for and the smile Quantum had yet to show, and nodded quietly before turning and walking to the classroom. They can't know the truth. Izuku is nothing if he isn't a hero. This is something he's known since he was young, since the first time he saw All Might standing tall, smiling despite the destruction around him. Since he saw him saving not only their bodies but their minds, giving Japan something to see as their protector. The symbol of peace. He's known since that day that was who he was meant to be. Someone like him, to give people hope and safety just by being there. He would save the people on the bottom of society's foot, who everybody else overlooked and scoffed at. He would save those with and without quirks, with weak or with villainous, with mutated or with incompatible. He would be the hope in the darkest, most run-down corners of Japan. There were a few basic facts he knew for certain in this world. He is nothing if he is not a hero. And a hero is nothing if they do not protect. He is 15, gangly legs and clumsy steps, voice cracks and emotions too big for his body. He is 15, and he has seen the worst of the worst through every step of his life. He's the only person in his class to have been through what he has been through, who has seen dozens upon dozens of villains and known that unless you did something, someone would die. Who has fought a renowned serial killer with nothing but sheer determination backing him up. The body of his friend at his feet, and a hero he can't tell if is alive or dead less than a meter away. Who has seen his life flash before his eyes and known that if this was the final fight, at least he would have saved one person. They haven't seen what he's seen. They haven't felt what he's felt. It was shown by the horror on their faces when they see his scars, by the flinch in their step when he mentions something offhandedly. They don't deserve to know, to have their peace tainted, their image of him changed. He is truly alone in this time, and he knows it well. He isn't upset by this fact, or bitter about being left without his original class that knows his trauma as well as their own. He understands. What he doesn't understand is why they won't accept this. He's grown complacent in his time in the past. The smile he used to wear as well as the shirt on his back fits like an old glove, too tight and cramped in the wrong places. He's forgotten how to smile even if the world is falling apart. He laughs and feels more genuinely happy than he has since the moment he entered that doctor's office over a decade ago. But it came at the cost of his only defense. Aizawa looks at him when he thinks he isn't paying attention. His face is as blank as he remembered it ever being, as some things never change, but he knows he's worried. Yamada has become a second skin to Izuku since that day he had his meltdown in his room. Yamada has grown more attached than he remembers anyone ever being to him. He bumps knees with him during lunch. He brushes his fingers along his back after training. He fashions his hair back from his eyes every day before practice. He holds his hand at the USJ and he presses himself against Izuku's back when they idle on campus. It's strange, but still comforting in a way he doesn't know how to identify. His touch burns like fire, but it leaves him warm for hours afterwards in a way that he finds nearly impossible to replicate. Shirakumo, however, is easily the most open with his concern. Whereas Aizawa and Yamada have made themselves a pillar in his life, a place to fall back on if he crumbles, Shirakumo has made himself a frontline soldier in the battle where he doesn't know heads from tails. He questions him relentlessly, hoping for a slip-up and a small piece of information to help him on his crusade, and watches him with a hawk's eye for anything that could give away clues. Izuku loves his friend dearly, but it does make this whole lone soldier shtick much harder. Shirakumo is loud and with a crude sense of humor, but he is observant, and he loves his friends more than anything in this world. He knows minimal about Izuku's battle, but he knows that he would go up to bat in a heartbeat. He just needs to know where he's swinging. He sees them fighting to be let in, but he is nothing if he can't save them from this. This isn't about his strange origins, about the starburst scars littering his back, about the strange recognition he has of all of them. This is more than any of that. If they knew, if they fought by his side, He can't watch his friends die. So when Aizawa brushes against his shoulder, an almost pleading look in his eyes, and when Shirakumo presses his hands against Izuku's cheeks with trembling fingers, he can do nothing other than look away and tell himself it's for the best. He'll save them. Even if they don't know they're being saved, it's what a hero does. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.